Hello everyone and welcome back to the creepy story. Now I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know you are listening from in the world. Also like, and let's get comfy and relaxed and let's get enjoying the subscribe it's begin. The cabin was supposed to be a quiet place for me to get some writing done. I rented it for 2 weeks, figuring the solitude and lack of distractions would help me focus. It was a small place, tucked into the woods, with no neighbors for miles. The nearest town was about a 30-minute drive, and the only way in or out was a winding road that was already half buried in snow by the time I arrived. The first few days were peaceful. The snow fell constantly, muffling everything around the cabin. It was so quiet that I could hear the occasional creak of the trees or the soft patter of snow sliding off the roof. I spent my days working on my manuscript and my nights reading by the fire. It was exactly what I needed. Then, on the fourth morning, I woke up and noticed something strange. The window near the front door had frost around the edges, and when I looked out, I saw footprints in the snow. They led from the edge of the tree line, about 50 yards away, straight to my front door. That alone wouldn't have been too odd, maybe a hiker or someone lost, but there were no footprints leading away. Just a single path to the door and nothing else. I stood there staring at them for a while, trying to figure it out. It had snowed all night, so they had to be fresh. I opened the door and stepped out into the cold. The prints were clear, boot-sized, and deep enough to show someone had walked through the snow not long before I woke up. But there was nothing else. No trail going back into the woods. No sign of anyone. I checked around the cabin, but everything seemed fine. The door had been locked, and the windows were secure. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe the snow I covered up the trail leading away or something like that. I didn't want to overthink it, so I went about my day. But the thought stayed with me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining someone standing outside, watching the cabin. I double-checked all the locks before bed and even dragged a chair in front of the door just in case. It felt ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the unease. The next morning, I woke up to the same thing. Footprints. This time, they were closer to the cabin, circling it. I could see the path clearly from the bedroom window. Someone had walked all the way around the cabin during the night, and just like before, there were no prints leading back to the trees. It was as if whoever it was had simply vanished. I grabbed a kitchen knife and went outside. The snow was falling lightly, but the prints were still there, fresh and distinct. They circled the cabin, passing under the windows and even near the back door. My heart was pounding as I followed them. The prints stopped just a few feet from the back door, and that was it. No sign of anyone. No trail back to the woods. I checked the cabin again, inside and out. Everything was locked, and nothing was missing. But the idea that someone had been that close while I slept made my skin crawl. I called the rental company to ask if there was anyone else staying in the area. They said no, the nearest property was several miles away, and it was unoccupied for the season. I didn't mention the footprints, I didn't want to sound paranoid. But by then, I was starting to feel like I wasn't alone out there. That night, I kept the fire going and stayed up as long as I could, staring at the windows and listening for any sound. It was dead silent outside, except for the occasional crack of a branch or the wind against the cabin. Around midnight, I finally dozed off on the couch, clutching the knife. I woke up to a loud knock. It was sharp and deliberate, coming from the front door. I froze, my heart racing. For a moment, I thought I dreamed it, but then it came again, 3 loud knocks. I grabbed the knife and crept to the door, trying to stay quiet. The knocking stopped, but when I peeked through the peephole, no one was there. The porch was empty, and the snow was still falling steadily. I opened the door just enough to look outside. The footprints were back, leading from the woods to the porch. There were more this time, crisscrossing each other, as if whoever it was had been pacing back and forth. I didn't see anyone, but the idea that they could still be out there, hiking in the dark, made my stomach turn. I slammed the door shut and locked it, then moved a heavy bookcase in front of it. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat by the window, watching the snow, clutching the knife, and waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. When the sun finally came up, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my things as quickly as I could and loaded them into the car. As I was locking up the cabin, I noticed something on the porch. A small object, half buried in the snow. It was a lighter, old and worn, with initials scratched into the side. I didn't recognize it, and it definitely wasn't mine. I left it where it was and got into the car. The drive back to town was slow and nerve-wracking. The snow had piled up overnight, making the road slippery and hard to navigate. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the middle of the road. But I didn't. When I got back to town, I stopped at a diner and tried to collect myself. I told one of the waitresses about the footprints, hoping she has some kind of explanation, but she just shook her head and said she'd never heard of anything like that happening before. I didn't stick around long. I just wanted to get as far away from that cabin as possible. It's been a few months now, and I still think about it. I don't know what was out there or what they wanted, but I can't shake the feeling that they're still watching me, waiting for me to go back. I haven't told anyone else about what happened. I'm not even sure I'd believe it if it hadn't happened to me. All I know is, I'll never stay in a place like that again. Oh. Yep. Then wake up, sleep. Go. The snow started falling the night I arrived at the rental. It was supposed to be a quiet week for me, just a break from everything. I'd booked the place because it was secluded, with nothing around but trees and a wide stretch of empty land. I thought the isolation would be peaceful, maybe even refreshing. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the snow was already coming down heavily, and the air had that dense, muffled quality that comes with a storm. The house itself was small but comfortable, with big windows that looked out over the yard and a fireplace in the living room. I spent the first evening unpacking, settling in, and listening to the wind pick up outside. By the time I went to bed, the snow had piled up enough to cover the lower half of the porch railing. The next morning, I was surprised to find the driveway completely cleared. It had snowed most of the night, and when I gone to bed, the driveway was buried. But now, it was clean, with neat lines of shoveled snow pushed to either side. I hadn't even heard anyone outside. It struck me as odd, but I figured maybe it was a neighbor being kind. I hadn't seen any other houses nearby on the way in, but maybe there was someone farther down the road. I made a mental note to thank whoever it was if I met them. That day passed quietly. I stayed inside, reading by the fire and watching the snow come down. It didn't stop for hours, and by the time I went to bed, the wind was howling so loud that it drowned out everything else. I remember lying awake for a while, thinking about how heavy the storm was getting. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, it was the same thing. The driveway was shoveled, and the snow pushed neatly to the sides. This time, I felt uneasy. It had snowed even harder during the night, and I hadn't heard anything, no scraping of a shovel, no crunching footsteps in the snow. I checked the windows, looking for tracks, but the driveway was the only thing disturbed. The yard, the porch, everything else was untouched. I tried to brush it off, but it stayed with me all day. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see someone. I didn't, though. The yard was empty, the trees were still, and the snow kept falling. That night, I decided to stay up and keep an eye on things. I turned off all the lights, sat by the window in the living room, and watched the driveway. It was almost 3 a.m. when I saw movement. A figure stepped out of the tree line at the edge of the yard, carrying a shovel. I froze, watching as they made their way to the driveway and started shoveling. They were methodical, moving in straight lines and tossing the snow aside with quick, practiced movements. I couldn't see much detail in the dark, but they were wearing a heavy coat with the hood pulled up. I thought about opening the door and calling out, but something stopped me. The way they moved, it was too precise, too mechanical. They didn't stop to rest or look around, just kept shoveling until the driveway was clear. Then they turned and walked back toward the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't sleep at all after that. I stayed by the window until the sun came up, watching the yard. The wind had calmed, and the snow had stopped falling. Everything was eerily still. It wasn't until mid-morning that I noticed the footprints. They started at the tree line, led to the driveway, and then back again. But there were no other prints, no sign of where they'd come from or gone to beyond the trees. It was as if they just appeared out of nowhere. That afternoon, I called the rental company. I asked if they knew of anyone nearby who might be clearing the driveway, but they said the property was isolated. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and they didn't provide any snow removal services. I hung up feeling unsettled. That night, I kept all the lights on. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and sat in the living room with a kitchen knife in my lap. I kept telling myself that it was just a neighbor being helpful, that there was nothing to worry about. But when I thought about the way they'd moved, the way they'd disappeared into the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint at first, like a soft scraping, but it grew louder. I realized it was coming from the front of the house. Heart pounding, I crept to the window and looked out. The figure was back, shuffling the driveway again. This time, I could see them more clearly in the glow of the porch light. Their coat was bulky and patched in places, and their movements were just as precise as before. I stayed frozen, watching them work. When they finished, they didn't go back to the trees. Instead, they stopped at the edge of the yard and turned toward the house. For a long moment, they just stood there, staring at the windows. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their eyes on me. My breath caught in my throat, and I ducked down, trying to stay out of sight. When I dared to peek again, they were gone. The next morning, I found something on the porch. It was a small pile of snow, shaped into a crude figure. It looked like a person, with stick arms and a lump for a head. It hadn't been there the night before. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was being watched, like whoever it was wanted me to know they'd been there. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things and loaded the car, keeping an eye on the trees the whole time. As I was pulling out of the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure standing at the edge of the yard, just watching me. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I can't stop thinking about the way they stood there, motionless, as I drove away. I'll never go back to that cabin. I don't even like to think about it. It was supposed to be a quick ski trip, something to clear my head. The slopes were crowded that weekend, more than I liked, so I decided to take a detour off the main trails. It wasn't anything reckless. I'd done this kind of thing before and knew the area well enough to navigate back without much trouble. The snow was untouched and crisp, and for a while, it felt perfect. just the sound of my skis cutting through the powder and the occasional gust of wind. I was about an hour in when I saw the campsite. It was tucked into a small clearing surrounded by trees, and the first thing I noticed was the tent. It was old and sagging under the weight of the snow, like it hadn't been touched in weeks. A fire pit sat in front of it, blackened but cold. There were no tracks, no skis or snowshoes, nothing that suggested someone was staying there recently. The whole scene felt wrong, out of place. This wasn't a popular area, and the weather had been bad for days. As I stood there, trying to decide if I should move on, I heard a voice behind me. "Hey! You lost." I turned, startled. A man was standing just a few yards away, holding a pair of ski poles. He wasn't dressed like most skiers I'd seen, no bright jackets or sleek gear. He wore a thick, patch coat, heavy snow pants, and a wool hat that looked soaked from the snow. His face was pale, his cheeks red from the cold. His eyes were sharp, almost too sharp, like he'd been watching me for longer than I realized. "No, I'm fine," I said. "Just passing through." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Not many people come this way. Dangerous, you know. Easy to get turned around." "I'm not far from the trail," I said, but now I wasn't so sure. "The trees all look the same in every direction." "You should stay," he said. "The weather's turning. Safer to stick together." I glanced at the sky. It was gray and heavy, but nothing suggested a storm was coming. Even so, there was something about the way he said it that made me uneasy, like it wasn't really a suggestion. "I appreciate it, but I'm heading back soon," I said. He didn't respond right away, just kept staring at me. Then, without another word, he walked past me toward the campsite. He crouched by the fire pit and started poking at it with a stick, like he was trying to get a fire going. I stood there, unsure of what to do. The clearing suddenly felt smaller, like the trees were pressing in. "You don't have to be stubborn about it," he said, not looking up. "I've got plenty of room. It's not smart to be out here alone." "I'm fine," I said again, trying to keep my voice steady. I turned my skis slightly, ready to leave, but then he stood up. "You're not fine," he said, louder this time. "You think you know this place. You don't. You'll get yourself killed." His tone had shifted, sharper, almost angry. My heart was racing now, and I felt trapped. The snow was deep, the trees thick, and this man, there was something off about him. He took a step toward me, his boots crunching loudly in the snow. "Look," I said, raising my hands. "I didn't mean to bother you. I'm just going to head back." "Bother me?" he said, laughing, but it didn't sound natural. "You can't leave now. Not in this weather. You'll freeze out there." I glanced behind me, trying to gauge the best direction to go. My tracks were still visible, leading back to where I'd come from, but the snow was falling lightly now, and I knew they wouldn't last long. "You're staying," he said firmly. "For safety." That was it. Something in his voice flipped a switch in me. I pushed off hard with my poles, turning sharply and heading back the way I came. My skis cut through the snow, and for a moment, I thought I was clear. But then I heard him behind me, shouting, "Hey! Stop!" I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. The terrain was uneven, and my skis wobbled as I dodged trees and small dips in the ground. My breath was loud in my ears, my chest burning with effort. I could hear him crashing through the snow, his boots slower but heavy. He was following me. The forest felt endless. I kept looking for landmarks, something familiar to guide me back to the trail, but everything looked the same. I was panicking, and I knew it. The snow was picking up now, thicker, and the light was fading fast. At some point, the sounds behind me faded. I slowed down, listening, but all I could hear was the wind and my own breathing. My legs were shaking, my hands numb even inside my gloves. I stopped, leaning against a tree, and scanned the area. Nothing. No movement, no sign of him. I waited, unsure of what to do. My tracks were faint now, barely visible under the fresh layer of snow. If I didn't find the main trail soon, I'd be stuck out here, and the temperature was already dropping. Then I saw him. He was standing a few dozen yards away, partially hidden behind a tree. He wasn't moving, just watching me. I don't know how long he'd been there, but the sight of him sent a jolt through me. I pushed off again, my skis clumsy as I tried to pick up speed. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees tighter, the snow deeper. I couldn't hear him anymore, but I didn't dare stop. When I finally saw the trailhead marker, it felt like a miracle. I stumbled onto the main path, my skis catching on the edge of the packed snow. There were people here, other skiers moving in groups, talking and laughing. I must have looked insane, barreling down the trail, breathing hard, my face pale. I didn't stop until I reached the lodge. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my boots off. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. The next day, I reported the campsite to the park staff. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but I never heard anything more about it. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I can still hear his voice sometimes, the way he said, "You're staying." I haven't gone skiing since. We moved into the cabin just before the first big snowfall of the season. It was remote, tucked in the woods about half a mile off a service road. The whole point was to get away for a bit, to slow down, have some peace. It was supposed to be a quiet winter, just me and Aaron. The night it happened, the snow was coming down hard. The wind was loud, shaking the windows and piling snow against the house. Aaron was in the kitchen making tea, and I was trying to get the wood stove going again. The power had gone out a few hours earlier, but we had plenty of firewood, so it wasn't a big deal. The house was dark except for the firelight and a couple of candles. I was adding another log when Erin called me from the front room. Her voice sounded strange, like she wasn't sure she wanted to say what she'd seen. "Do you hear that?" she asked. I stopped and listened. At first, all I could hear was the wind. It was constant, howling through the trees and riling the door. But then I heard it, something faint, almost drowned out by the storm. A low, steady hum. It sounded like an engine. I went to the window and squinted into the darkness. The snow was blowing so hard I couldn't see more than a few feet. The sound was definitely there, though, somewhere close by. "Maybe someone got stuck," Erin said. She sounded nervous. "Should we check?" I didn't want to go out in the storm, but if someone was stranded, I couldn't just ignore it. I grabbed my coat, gloves, and a flashlight. Erin stayed by the window, watching as I opened the door. The cold hit me like a wall, and the wind nearly tore the door out of my hand. I stepped outside, pulling my scarf tighter around my face. The sound of the engine was louder now, coming from somewhere off to the left. I followed it, shining the flashlight through the trees. The snow was already up to my knees, and it was slow going. After a few minutes, I saw something, a dark shape just off the driveway. As I got closer, I realized it was a truck. The front end was buried in snow, almost up to the hood, but the engine was running. The headlights were off, and the windows were fogged up. I walked around to the driver's side and knocked on the glass. No one answered. I tried the door handle, and it opened. The cab was empty. The engine was warm, humming quietly, and the keys were in the ignition. There were footprints in the snow leading away from the truck, disappearing into the trees. Whoever had been inside hadn't been gone long, but there was no sign of them now. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The truck didn't look abandoned. There was a duffel bag on the passenger seat, and a thermos in the cup holder. It looked like someone had been sitting there just moments ago. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the wind. I shone the flashlight into the woods, following the footprints, but the snow was coming down so fast they were already fading. I didn't know what to do. The truck was running, but no one was around. It didn't make sense. I hurried back to the house. Erin was waiting by the door, her face pale. "What did you see?" she asked. "There's a truck," I said. "But no one's in it. The engine's on, and there are tracks leading into the woods." She looked past me, toward the driveway, but it was just darkness and snow. "Do you think they're lost?" "I don't know," I said. "It's not safe out there." I didn't see anyone. We stood there for a moment, listening to the storm. The sound of the engine was still faintly audible, blending with the wind. Something about it made my stomach turn. It felt wrong, like whoever had been in the truck had no reason to leave it, especially in this weather. "I'll call someone," Erin said. But the phone was out, and the cell signal was spotty at best. She stared at her phone, shaking it like that would help. "Should we go back out?" I shook my head. "It's too dangerous. We'll wait. If they come back, they'll see the house." We locked the door and sat by the fire, waiting. The minutes dragged on, and the sound of the engine seemed to grow louder, even though the truck hadn't moved. I kept looking at the window, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the yard was empty. Just snow and shadows. After about an hour, I decided to check again. Erin didn't want me to go, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside. The wind had died down a little, but the snow was deeper now, making it even harder to move. When I reached the truck, the engine was off. The headlights were still dark, and the cab was just as empty as before. The footprints that had led into the woods were completely gone, buried under the fresh snow. It was like no one had ever been there. I walked around the truck, shining the light into the trees. Nothing. The duffel bag was still on the seat, untouched. I opened it, hoping for some clue, but it was just clothes and a few personal items. A wallet, a toothbrush, a pair of gloves. The wallet had an ID, a man named Michael. I didn't recognize the name, and the address wasn't local. I stood there, staring at the truck, trying to make sense of it. The snow muffled everything, making the world feel smaller, like I was the only person left. Then I saw something, a shadow moving between the trees. "Hello?" I called out. The shadow didn't respond. It moved again, closer this time, but I couldn't see who it was. The flashlight beam barely penetrated the darkness. I took a step back, my heart pounding. "Michael?" I try again. The shadow stopped. For a moment, everything was silent except for the wind. Then, without warning, it darted away, disappearing into the woods. I didn't follow. I ran back to the house as fast as I could, tripping over my own feet in the deep snow. When I burst through the door, Erin jumped. "What happened?" she asked. "There's someone out there," I said, struggling to catch my breath. "I don't know who, but they're not coming to the house." We didn't sleep that night. We sat by the fire, listening to the storm and watching the windows. The sound of the engine was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been in the woods was still out there, watching. The next morning, when the snow finally stopped, we went outside together. The truck was gone. The only thing left was a patch of flattened snow where it had been. There were no tracks, no sign of how it had been moved. We packed our things and left that afternoon. I don't know what happened to Michael, or who was out there that night. I don't want to know. The night it happened, the cold was biting. It was late, and the streets on campus were almost deserted. The ground was slick with ice, and snow had started falling again, soft but steady. I'd stayed late after class to finish an assignment in the library, and by the time I left, it was already close to midnight. I hadn't wanted to bother anyone for a ride since I lived only a 10-minute walk away. The path I took was the same as always, cutting across the courtyard near the Humanities building, then down a long, quiet stretch of road with streetlights spaced far apart. There were no cars parked along the street that night, probably because of the weather. The sidewalks were icy, so I walked slowly, careful not to slip. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The sound of footsteps behind me seemed faint, like they were being muffled by the snow. I told myself it was probably someone heading home like I was, but I still glanced over my shoulder. The street was empty. I kept walking, but the sound was there again a few steps later. It was too deliberate to be the wind or the rustling of branches. I stopped and turned fully around this time, shining my phone flashlight down the length of the street. The beam barely cut through the falling snow, but as far as I could see, no one was there. I felt a little silly for being jumpy, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I pulled my coat tighter and started walking faster, my boots crunching against the frozen ground. That's when the footsteps behind me sped up too. It was subtle, like whoever it was didn't want to be noticed. But they weren't as quiet as they thought. I heard the uneven rhythm of their steps slipping slightly on the ice. I didn't turn around again right away. My heart was racing, and I didn't want whoever it was to know I'd noticed them. I thought about calling someone, but I didn't know who would answer the slate. I tried to act normal, like I wasn't in a hurry, even though my instincts were screaming at me to run. The sound stayed with me as I turned the corner onto the next street. This one was darker, with fewer working streetlights. I was only a few blocks from my apartment, but it felt like the distance stretched out with every step. The snow was falling heavier now, and the wind picked up, cutting through my coat. When I turned my head slightly, just enough to look back without making it obvious, I saw him. He was about 20 feet behind me, wearing a dark jacket with the hood pulled up. His face was hard to make out, but he wasn't trying to hide. He just walked, keeping the same distance between us, matching my pace almost perfectly. I debated running, but the sidewalk was too slippery, and I knew I wouldn't get far. Instead, I crossed the street suddenly, hoping it would throw him off. For a moment, I thought it worked. He stopped walking, standing still on the opposite side, just watching me. I tried to keep my breath steady as I continued toward my building. My hand was already in my pocket, gripping my cheese, ready to get inside as quickly as possible. But then I heard the sound again, his boots crunching on the ice. He was crossing the street now, closing the distance between us. The panic hit me fully then. I glanced around, looking for anyone, anything that could help, but the streets were completely empty. No cars, no open shops, no one walking their dog. It was just me and him, alone in the cold. When I reached the corner, I made another sharp turn and ducked into an alleyway between two buildings. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible, and held my breath. My heart was pounding so loudly I was afraid he'd hear it. The footsteps grew louder, closer. He was coming down the alley. I could see his shadow stretch across the snow as he passed under the dim light near the entrance. I gripped my keys tighter, holding them between my fingers like I'd seen in those self-defense videos online. My hands were shaking, and my breath came in short, shallow bursts. Then he stopped, right at the mouth of the alley. He stood there for what felt like forever, just staring into the darkness. I couldn't see his face clearly, but his head turned slowly, like he was scanning for movement. The snow muffled everything, and the silence was unbearable. I didn't dare move. After a long moment, he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading until they were gone completely. I waited another minute before stepping out from the shadows. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to keep moving. My apartment was just 2 blocks away, and I was determined to get there without drawing any more attention. I thought I was safe when I reached the door. I fumbled with my keys, trying to unlock it as quickly as possible, but my fingers were stiff from the cold. As I finally got the door open and stepped inside, I heard it again, the crunch of boots on snow. He was standing at the end of the block, just barely visible under the glow of the streetlight. He wasn't walking anymore. He wasn't even pretending to. He was just standing there, watching me. I slammed the door shut and locked it. My apartment felt suffocatingly quiet after the noise of the storm. I peeked through the peephole but couldn't see him anymore. Still, I didn't feel safe. I double-checked the locks on the windows and pulled the curtains tight. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor with my back against the door, clutching my phone and a kitchen knife. I didn't sleep. Every little sound outside made me jump, but he didn't come back. The next morning, when the sun came up, I forced myself to go outside. I had to know if I'd imagined it or if he'd really been there. The snow in front of the building was undisturbed except for a single set of footprints leading up to the door and stopping right where I'd stood. There were no prints leading away. I moved out of that apartment before the next snowfall. The night was rough. The kind of rough where the road disappears under the snow, and the wipers can't keep up. I'd been hauling through Wyoming, trying to make it to the next truck stop before the worst of the storm hit. It wasn't my first time driving in weather like that, but the snow was heavier than usual, and the wind made the rig feel like it was skating on the ice. I saw him on a stretch of road that felt like the middle of nowhere. Just a figure standing at the shoulder, half buried in snow, waving one arm while the other hugged something to his chest. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or a trick of the snow. Then my headlights caught him, and there he was, solid and real. He didn't look dressed for the weather. No heavy covert gloves, just a thin jacket and jeans. I don't usually pick people up. Not with all the stories you hear. But I couldn't leave him out there. It was freezing, and the snow was already deep enough to make walking impossible. He'd have frozen to death if I drove past. So, I slowed down and pulled the Reek to the side, rolling the window down just enough to yell over the wind. "You need a ride." He nodded, teeth chattering so hard I could hear it. He climbed up into the cab without a word and slammed the door shut, dragging a small duffel bag onto his lap. Snow fell off him in clumps, melting onto the seat. His face was red from the cold, and his fingers looked stiff, like he'd been out there for a while. "Where you heading?" I asked, pulling back onto the road. He didn't answer right away. He just stared out the window, his hands gripping the bag like it was the only thing keeping him alive. After a few seconds, he muttered, "Anywhere." That wasn't helpful, but I figured I'd take him to the next truck stop or town, or ever had a warm place he could wait out the storm. I turned the heat up and tried to focus on the road, though it was hard not to glance at him every now and then. Something about the way he sat there made me uneasy. He didn't try to make conversation, didn't thank me, didn't even look at me. Just stared out into the storm. We'd been driving for maybe 10 minutes when he spoke again, so quietly I almost didn't hear him over the engine. "Are they following us?" I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him right. "What?" "Are they following us?" he repeated, louder this time. He turned to look at me, and his eyes were wide, almost frantic. "There's no one out there," I said, trying to sound calm. "We're the only ones on the road." He shook his head, his hands gripping the bag tighter. "You don't know that. You didn't see them." "See who?" He didn't answer. He just turned back to the window, his breath fogging up the glass. I didn't press him. People out in weather like this aren't usually thinking straight. Maybe he was just scared or disoriented from the cold. I kept my eyes on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A few miles later, he asked again, "Are they still back there?" This time, his voice was sharper, almost desperate. I glanced at the side mirrors, but the road behind us was nothing but darkness and snow. "There's no one behind us," I said firmly. "It's just us out here." He didn't look convinced. "You'd say that, wouldn't you?" he muttered, more to himself than to me. That's when I noticed the bag. He hadn't let go of it since he got in, not even to warm his hands by the fence. It wasn't big, just a plain black duffel that looked like it had seen better days. The way he held onto it, though, made it seem like there was something important inside. Or something he didn't want me to see. I didn't ask about it. I figured whatever was in there was none of my business. But the tension in the cab was thick enough to choke on, and I found myself gripping the wheel tighter, wishing the miles would pass faster. Out of nowhere, he shouted, "Slow down." I slammed on the brakes instinctively, the truck skidding slightly on the icy road. My heart was pounding as I scanned the road ahead, expecting to see a deer or a car stuck in the snow. But there was nothing. Just white drifts and swirling wind. "What the hell's wrong with you?" I snapped, trying to steady my voice. "Tear up ahead," he said, his voice trembling. I saw them. "There's nothing there," I said, my patience wearing thin. "You're imagining things." "I'm not," he yelled, slamming his fist against the dashboard. "You don't understand. They're out there, and they're not going to stop." I stared at him, my hands still gripping the wheel. He was breathing hard, his eyes darting around the cab like a trapped animal. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to throw him out, storm or no storm, but the other part of me didn't want to stop. Not with the way he was acting. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I don't know what you think you saw, but there's no one out here. Just sit back and relax, and I'll get you somewhere safe." He didn't say anything, but he didn't sit back either. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, his shoulders tense, like he was ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. I tried to focus on driving, but my nerves were shot. Every shadow in the snow looked like a person, every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Then I saw it. Up ahead, just barely visible in the headlights, was a figure standing in the middle of a road. They weren't moving, just standing there, like they were waiting for us. My stomach dropped, and I slowed the truck to a crawl. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath. "See?" the hitchhiker said, his voice shaking. "I told you." I didn't respond. I was too focused on the figure. As we got closer, I could make out more details. A man, dressed in dark clothes, his face hidden by a hood. He didn't react to the headlights or the sound of the engine. He just stood there, motionless. I didn't stop. I couldn't. Something about him made my skin crawl. I steered around him slowly, keeping as much distance as I could. The hitchhiker was practically vibrating with tension, his hands clutching the bag so hard his knuckles were white. When we passed the figure, I glanced in the mirror. He was still standing there, but now he was turned toward us, watching as we drove away. The hitchhiker saw it too and let out a low, panicked sound. "They're going to follow us," he whispered. "Who is?" I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. He didn't answer. He just hunched over the bag, rocking slightly, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. I didn't ask again. I didn't want to know. We didn't see anyone else after that, but the tension in the cab was suffocating. By the time we reached the next town, my nerves were shot. I pulled into the parking lot of a small diner and told the hitchhiker this was as far as I could take him. He didn't argue. He just climbed out of the cab, clutching the bag like it was his lifeline. He stood there in the snow for a moment, staring at me through the windshield, before turning and walking away. I didn't wait to see where he went. I pulled back onto the road and didn't stop until I was hours away. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he was running from. But sometimes, when driving at night, I catch myself checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. The first night I noticed him, I thought it was just bad luck with parking. My street is quiet, mostly families and retirees. It's not the kind of place where people linger. But his car was there, parked just across the street, engine off, snow piling up around it like he had been sitting there for hours. I figured maybe he was waiting for someone, though I couldn't think of who. It was late, after 10. I just finished washing up in the kitchen when I glanced out the front window. The snow was coming down hard, blanketing the road and muffling everything. His car was the only one out there, a black sedan, the kind that looks the same as 100 other cars. I couldn't see much through the windshield, but the faint glow of his interior light made it clear there was someone inside. A shadow, still and quiet. I stood there for a minute, staring. Something about it unsettled me, though I couldn't put my finger on why. It wasn't unusual for people to park on the street. It was the fact that he hadn't moved. He didn't get out. He didn't turn on the engine to warm up. Just sat there, motionless. I told myself I was being paranoid. I went back to my routine and tried not to think about it. By the time I checked again before bed, the car was gone. I went to sleep telling myself it had been nothing. The second night, he was back. Same car, same spot, same heavy snowfall. I noticed him around the same time, just after 10, when I went to close the curtains. This time, I lingered at the window, watching. I thought maybe he'd step out or start the car to leave. But he didn't. He just sat there again, unmoving. I tried to brush it off as coincidence. Maybe he was waiting for someone who lived on the street. Maybe he'd gotten stuck in the snow, though it didn't look like his tires were spinning. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept peeking through the curtains, just to see if he'd moved. He didn't. That night, I called my neighbor, Miss Daly. She lives 2 doors down and keeps an eye on the street better than anyone else. She hadn't noticed anything unusual, but she said she'd look out her window and let me know if she saw anything strange. I hung up and felt silly for even bringing it up. When I checked again just before bed, his car was gone. Same as the night before. I told myself it was probably nothing, but it was harder to convince myself this time. It wasn't just the car. It was the way he sat there, completely still. No phone light, no movement, nothing. The third night, I was waiting for him. It had been snowing all day, and by evening, the roads were barely passable. Most of the neighbors had turned in early, their porch lights off, curtains drawn. I stayed in the living room, keeping the lights low and the curtains cracked just enough to see the street. Sure enough, just after 10, the car pulled up. It didn't stop right away. It slowed down, rolling past my house before backing into the same spot across the street. The headlights flicked off, and the car sat there, silent and dark. This time, I didn't look away. I sat there in the shadows, watching. He was inside, though I couldn't see much of him. The silhouette of his head and shoulders was faintly visible through the windshield. He wasn't slumped like he was sleeping or leaning forward like he was doing something. Just sitting upright, perfectly still. I told myself to call the police. But what could I say? A man parked on the street 3 nights in a row. He hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't gotten out of the car or approached my house. He hadn't even looked at the window, as far as I could tell. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to try and get a closer look. Maybe if I saw his face, I'd recognize him. Maybe he was someone I knew, someone from the neighborhood. I grabbed my coat and boots, slipping them on as quietly as I could. I didn't want him to see the light shift or hear the door open. The cold hit me as soon as I stepped outside. The snow was up to my ankles, and the wind bit at my face. I kept to the side of the house, staying in the shadows. My heart was pounding in my chest, louder than the crunch of my boots in the snow. The closer I got, the more I could see. His car was covered in a thin layer of frost, the snow piling up on the hood. The windows were fogged, except for a small circle near the top of the windshield where the heat from his breath must have melted it. While I was close enough to see the car clearly, I stopped. My breath froze in the air, and I felt my stomach drop. He was staring right at me. I don't know how long he'd been watching me, but his head was turned toward me, his face just visible through the gap in the frost. I couldn't make out his features, just the dark hollows of his eyes. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. Just stared, like he had been waiting for me to step outside. I backed up slowly, my boots crunching in the snow. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone when I tried to pull it out of my pocket. I wanted to call the police, but I was terrified that if I stopped looking at him, he'd get out of the car. I was halfway back to the house when I heard the car door open. The sound made me freeze. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and my chest was so tight I couldn't breathe. "Excuse me," he called, his voice cutting through the storm. It was calm, almost polite. "Can you help me?" I forced myself to turn, just enough to see him. He was standing by the car now, his hands in his pockets, snow swirling around him. His breath came out in clouds, but he didn't seem cold. He was too calm, too still. I shook my head and took another step back. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I can't help you." He didn't respond right away. He just stood there, watching me. Then, without a word, he climbed back into the car and shut the door. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I ran back to the house, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the window, watching, waiting for him to leave. Sometime after midnight, he finally did. The headlights came on, cutting through the snow, and the car rolled away, disappearing into the storm. I stayed up until dawn, afraid he'd come back. The next day, I called the police. They said they'd send someone to patrol the area, but there wasn't much they could do. The car didn't come back the next night or the night after that. I never saw him again. But sometimes, when it snows, I find myself looking out the window, waiting for the headlights to appear. I took the job at the lodge because I needed a change. It was supposed to be a quiet few months, managing the place while the owners were away. A skeleton crew came by during the day to handle maintenance and housekeeping, but at night, I was completely alone. That was part of the appeal. I thought it'd give me time to figure things out, maybe write a little. The place was huge but cozy, tucked away in the mountains and surrounded by snow for miles. The first letter showed up about a week after I arrived. I found it and went to lock up for the night. It was slipped under the front door, just a plain white envelope with nothing written on it. I thought it was strange since the lodge wasn't exactly easy to get to. The road up here was icy and steep, and most guests wouldn't bother making the trip with our reservation. Still, I figured someone must have dropped it off during the day. I opened it in the kitchen while making tea. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly in half. The handwriting was messy, almost rushed, and the message was short. "How are you liking the quiet nights, Noah?" I stared at it for a while, trying to figure out who it was from. The only people who knew I was here were the owners and the few staff who came by during the day. I didn't recognize the handwriting, and there was no name at the bottom. I decided it was probably one of the staff playing a joke. Maybe it was Martin, the handyman. He had a dry sense of humor and liked to tease me about being up here alone. The next morning, I brought it up casually when Martin came by to check the boiler. He looked genuinely confused. "I didn't leave any letter," he said. "Why would I drive up here just for that?" I felt a little embarrassed for even mentioning it. He laughed it off and told me not to get spooked. "The snow does weird things to people," he said. "Maybe it's just a guest who wanted to be clever." I nodded, but it didn't sit right with me. There were no guests staying at the lodge that week. The bookings were light until after the holidays. That night, I found the second letter. This time, I was in the lobby, going over the reservations for the next month. It was just past 10 when I heard something slide against the floor. My stomach dropped. I looked toward the door and saw another envelope lying there. I didn't move at first. I just sat there, staring at it. Whoever had left it was close enough to the door to push it through. The snow outside was thick, and I hadn't heard a car. My hands were shaking when I finally picked it up. This one was worse. "You never finish your tea, do you? Always leave half the cup on the counter." I felt cold all over. I had done exactly that earlier that evening. I'd left a cup on the kitchen counter, still half full, because I'd gotten distracted by a phone call. The only way someone could have known that was if they'd been inside the lodge. I spent the next hour checking every door and window, making sure they were locked. The owners had installed cameras outside, but only near the parking lot and back entrance. The front door wasn't covered. I went through the footage anyway, hoping to see something, but the screens just showed snow and empty driveways. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the lights on in the office and stayed up, listening for any sound, but the lodge was silent. The third letter came 2 days later. I had started keeping the front door bolted at all times. I'd also started carrying one of the kitchen knives with me whenever I left my room. It wasn't much, but it made me feel less helpless. I found the envelope on the desk in the office. Not under the door. Not in the lobby. On the desk, next to my notebook. It was another simple message. The green room still smells like paint, doesn't it? You should have opened the window longer. My chest tightened while I read it. The day before, I had gone into the green room, the one with the fresh coat of paint, to take some pictures for the owners. I'd opened the window to let the smell out, but I hadn't left it open for long because the room was freezing. Someone had been in the lodge while I was here. I was sure of it now. I called the police that afternoon, even though I knew it wouldn't help much. A deputy came by to take a report, but there wasn't much he could do. The snow covered any tracks outside, and there was no sign of forced entry. He suggested I might have left a door unlocked without realizing it. Let us know if anything else happens, he said. Then he left. That night, I stayed in the office with the door locked and a knife on the desk in front of me. I tried to convince myself it was over, that whoever had been messing with me was done now that the police had come by. But then I heard footsteps. They were faint at first, just soft creaks coming from the lobby. I froze, my hand tightening around the knife. The footsteps moved slowly, heading toward the hall outside the office. I stayed perfectly still, my heart pounding in my ears. The door was locked, but it felt paper thin. If someone wanted to get in, it wouldn't take much. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Who's there? I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. There was no answer. Just silence. I sat there for what felt like hours, waiting for the footsteps to start again, but they didn't. Eventually, I worked up the courage to move. I grabbed a knife and opened the door as quietly as I could. The hall was empty. I checked every room in the lodge, my pulse racing with every step. There was no one there. No sign that anyone had been there. I found the fourth letter in the lobby the next morning. You didn't check the basement. That was it. I packed my bags and left that day. I called the owners and told them I was done. They offered to let me stay in one of their other properties, closer to town, but I refused. I just wanted to go home. I never figured out who was leaving the letters. The owners said they'd look into it, but I never heard anything else. To this day, I can't explain how they knew the things they did. I haven't taken another job like that since. What? They... The snow was coming down thick while I lost control. The road had been getting worse for miles, but I thought I could make it. I wasn't far from my friend's house, maybe 10, 15 minutes, but it was dark, and the snow plows hadn't come through yet. I hit a patch of ice, and my tires spun. I barely had time to think before my car slid off the road and into the ditch. It wasn't a violent crash. The snow cushioned most of the impact, but my car wasn't going anywhere. The front end was buried, and no matter how much I pressed the gas, the tires just spun uselessly. I tried calling for help, but I couldn't get a signal. My phone kept flashing no service, and the storm was too heavy to see any landmarks. I was somewhere on a back road, surrounded by trees, with no other cars in sight. I sat there for a while, trying to decide what to do. I had a blanket in the back and a little water, but no real supplies. I didn't know how long I'd be stuck, and the temperature was dropping fast. I figured my best chance was to flag someone down. About 30 minutes later, I saw headlights. A truck was coming up a road, moving slow through the storm. I jumped out of the car and waved my arms. The driver honked and pulled over a little ahead of me. He rolled down his window as I approached. He was a middle-aged man, heavy-set, with a thick beard. His truck was old, the kind you'd expect on a farm, with a bed full of tools and chains. "You all right?" he asked, leaning out to look at my car. I slid off the road, I said, my voice shaking from the cold. "My phone doesn't have service. Can you help me call for a tow or something?" He glanced back at my car, then at the storm. "No one's coming out in this," he said. "Not until the snow lets up. You're not going to get any help tonight." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. What should I do, then? He thought for a moment, then said, "I can take you somewhere warm. There's a diner about 20 miles back. They'll have coffee, maybe a phone that works." 20 miles sounded far, but I didn't see any other options. I hesitated, though. "Do you have a phone I could use? Just to let someone know where I am?" His face hardened a little. "Signal spotty out here," he said. "Come on, you don't want to be out in this cold. Get in." I hesitated again, but the wind was biting, and I couldn't stand the thought of spending the night in my car. I climbed into the passenger seat, brushing snow off my coat. The truck was warm, and the heater blasted hot air as we pulled back onto the road. He didn't say much at first, just drove in silence, his hands tight on the wheel. I tried to relax, but something about him felt off. "Thanks for stopping," I said after a while, trying to fill the quiet. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come by." He didn't look at me, just nodded. "Storm's a bad one. Lucky I saw you." I nodded, too, but I was starting to feel uneasy. His truck smelled faintly of oil and sweat, and the radio was turned off. The windows fogged up quickly, making it hard to see outside. "Do you think I could try your phone?" I asked again, trying to sound casual. "Just for a second. I want to let my friend know I'm okay." He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Battery's dead." The way he said it was flat, like he was annoyed I'd asked. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. His jaw was tight, his gaze fixed on the road. We drove in silence for a while. The snow was relentless, and the wipers struggled to keep up. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but my mind kept racing. Something about this didn't feel right. "Where's the diner, exactly?" I asked after a long stretch of silence. He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "A little ways ahead." That didn't help. I shifted in my seat, suddenly aware of how isolated we were. The road was deserted, and the trees pressed in on both sides. I glanced at the dashboard, and the fuel gauge was nearly empty. "You're running low on gas," I said, trying to sound conversational. He grunted. "We'll make it." His tone was sharp, like he didn't want me pointing it out. My unease grew. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" I asked, forcing a smile. "I don't remember seeing a diner back there." This time, he looked at me. Just a quick glance, but his expression sent a chill through me. "I know these roads better than you," he said. That was when I decided I needed to get out of the truck. I didn't know how far we'd driven, but it didn't feel right. The snow was heavy, and the night was pitch black, but staying felt worse. My heart pounded as I tried to think of a way to leave without angering him. I faked a cough, then said, "Can you pull over? I think I'm going to be sick." He frowned, glancing at me again. "We're almost there," he said. I can't wait, I said, clutching my stomach. Please, I just need a minute. He muttered something under his breath but eventually slowed the truck. He pulled onto the side of the road, the tires crunching over the snow. As soon as we stopped, I fumbled with the door handle and stepped out. The cold hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I moved quickly away from the truck, pretending to lean over like I was sick. Don't wander off, he called after me. You'll get lost out here. I nodded, keeping my back to him. My breath fogged in the air as I tried to think. I couldn't just run, the snow would slow me down, and he'd catch me easily. Come on, he said after a minute. Let's get moving. I turned to face him, my heart racing. I think I'll wait here, I said. Someone else will come by. His face darkened. Don't be stupid, he said. No one's coming. Get back in the truck. I stood my ground, even though my legs were shaky. I'll be fine, I said. He got out of the truck then, slamming the door hard enough to make me flinch. He was bigger than I realized, his shoulders broad under his jacket. You don't know what you're doing, he said, walking toward me. I backed up, slipping slightly in the snow. Stay back, I said, my voice trembling. He stopped, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, we just stood there, the snow falling thick between us. Then, without a word, he turned and got back in the truck. The engine roared to life, and he drove off, leaving me standing there in the dark. It took hours for another car to come by. By then, I was frozen to the bone, but I didn't care. The couple who picked me up were kind and took me to a gas station where I could call for help. I never found out who he was or what he wanted. But I know one thing for sure, I wasn't imagining the way he looked at me when I said no. I went out on a snowshoeing trip last winter, something to clear my head. I wasn't used to being out there alone for long, but I needed the solitude. It was early afternoon, the snow was coming down heavy but steady, and the trees around me were weighed down with the stuff. The world felt quiet, except for the crunch of my snowshoes and the occasional gust of wind rattling the branches. I'd been walking for a while, not really heading anywhere in particular. I've left the marked trail a bit to explore the forest, just to get away from the noise of the world for a while. The deeper I got, the less I could hear anything except the sound of my own footsteps and the occasional bird or squirrel making a quick dash through the snow. After an hour or so, I noticed something odd. There were snowmen. At first, it didn't really register, but then I stopped and looked more closely. They were scattered through the trees in a line. Some of them were small, others taller, but they all had the same basic features: coal for eyes, sticks for arms, and a ragged scarf tied around their necks. Nothing seemed too out of place. It wasn't unusual for someone to leave a snowman behind if they were out here, but the first thing I thought was that there were more than I expected. I walked a bit further, and then I saw another one, and then another. There were at least 10 of them now, all spaced in a line that seemed to stretch further into the woods than I could see. The weird thing wasn't that they were there, it was that they all seemed to be facing me. I couldn't help but feel uneasy about it. As I passed the first snowman, I gave it a quick glance. It was built kind of poorly, but nothing stood out about it. I kept walking. But when I passed a second, it felt like it was watching me. I glanced over my shoulder to see if there was something behind me, but no, the snow was empty. Just trees, snow, and more snowmen, lined up and facing me. That feeling, that nagging suspicion, stuck with me as I moved further along the trail. Each snowman I passed had its gaze fixed in my direction. The air felt heavy, and my pace slowed as I noticed more and more of them, more than I should have been able to account for. My heart started beating faster. The snowmen had been scattered a bit when I first saw them, but now it seemed like they were more strategically placed. A little too close to one another. I turned around, scanning the woods behind me. Everything was still, and I felt the cold creeping up my spine, the kind that comes when you realize something isn't quite right. It's hard to explain, but the more I walked, the more I felt like I wasn't alone out there. I kept moving, trying to shake the feeling off. It was just snowmen, I told myself. People come out here all the time. Someone probably made them as a joke. But the further I went, the more unnerving it became. They weren't random anymore. Each one seemed intentionally placed, perfectly lined up in the trees, always watching me, always facing me. I decided to turn back. It was getting later, and the snow was falling harder. If I didn't start heading back soon, I'd get caught in a full-blown storm. But when I tried to retrace my steps, the snowmen were still there. They weren't just in the trees anymore. Some were off the trail, closer to where I had walked in. I couldn't have passed that many on my way in. It didn't make sense. That's when I stopped. I stood there in the snow, my breath coming out in heavy clouds. The cold started to creep into my skin, but it was more than that. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to call out, but my voice sounded muffled, like I was suffocating under the weight of the snow and the trees around me. I started walking faster, but the snowmen seemed to appear in front of me. More and more of them were everywhere I turned, each one positioned so it was still facing me. I realized they were following me. I turned again. There was no one behind me, just more of them. They were everywhere. My breath was short now, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My legs felt weak, but I kept walking, faster, faster. I didn't want to run. I didn't want to give in to whatever was happening. But every time I looked, there was another snowman, another set of cold eyes staring at me, another twisted pile of snow just watching me like it knew something I didn't. I thought I saw something move in the distance. I froze, holding my breath, and waited. But there was nothing. The wind held through the trees, and the snow continued to fall heavier and faster. The woods felt endless now, like it was closing in on me. The snowmen still surrounded me, their dark eyes following my every move. I kept moving. I couldn't stay out there. Not with them watching me. I tapped my eyes on the ground as I walked, making sure not to look up at any of them. I couldn't let myself see them. I couldn't let myself believe they were real. But the panic was overwhelming, the sensation of being watched crawling up my spine. The snow started to pick up in intensity, the visibility dropping lower and lower. I had to squint to see anything in front of me. Then, I saw something familiar. A path marker. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me direction. I could tell I was near the edge of the trail. I picked up my pace, ignoring the snowmen, ignoring the strange, unsettling feeling that still hung in the air. I kept walking, refusing to look back. The wind hit me hard, stinging my face and numbing my fingers, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Finally, I broke through the trees and back onto the main trail. The snow was still falling, but the snowmen were gone. I never saw them again. But I know they were real. When I made it back to the car, I sat there for a long time, just trying to breathe. Trying to make sense of what had just happened. I still don't know if I was just losing my mind out there or if something else was at play. But I do know this. I'll never go back into those woods alone. Not after that. Here's what happened, and I still can't believe I got out of it. I've never written anything like this before, so I'm sorry if it doesn't make sense. I just need to put it somewhere. It was January, and I decided to take a solo trip up to the ski lodge I'd found online. It wasn't one of those big fancy resorts, just a quiet spot tucked into the mountains. I thought it would be a good way to clear my head after the holidays. Work had been stressful, and I wanted time to myself. The place seemed perfect, small, not crowded, just a handful of taverns spread out around the lodge. It felt remote, but not too far from the nearest town. The first day was great. I spent the morning on the slopes and the afternoon sitting by the fireplace in the lodge. It was peaceful, quiet. I even made small talk with the woman who ran the front desk, an older lady named Carol. She seemed nice enough, though she didn't talk much. Just handed me my tea and told me to let her know if I needed anything. The trouble started the second day. I was up early, ready to hit the slopes again. It had snowed overnight, and everything looked fresh and untouched. I grabbed my gear from the rack outside my cabin and headed to the lift. When I got there, though, something felt off. My bindings didn't look right. At first, I thought maybe the snow had just settled weird on them overnight, but when I bent down to check, I realized one of the screws was loose. Not just loose, gone. I'm not an expert, but I know enough to realize how dangerous that could have been. If I'd gone down the slope and my binding had come off, I could have broken my leg or worse. I was annoyed, but I figured it was just wear and tear. I took it back to the lodge and borrowed a screwdriver from Terrell. I asked her if anyone had messed with the gear rack, but she just shrugged and said no one ever really touched other people's stuff. By the time I got everything fixed, half the morning was gone. I hit the slopes anyway, trying to shake off the weird feeling in my gut. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was just bad luck. That evening, when I got back to my cabin, I found a note slipped under the door. It was on plain white paper, folded in half. The handwriting was messy, almost like whoever wrote it was in a hurry. It said, "Don't go back out there." I stood there holding it for what felt like forever, just staring at the words. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of joke. Maybe one of the other guests was messing with me. But the thing was, I hadn't really talked to anyone. Aside from Terrell, I hadn't seen much of anyone around. I thought about going to her, showing her the note, but something held me back. It felt silly, like I'd be overreacting. Instead, I locked the door, double-checked all the windows, and tried to convince myself there was nothing. The next day, I almost didn't go skiing. I thought about staying in the cabin, maybe reading or taking a walk around the lodge. But then I got mad. Why should I let some stupid note ruin my trip? I'd spent good money to be there, and I wasn't about to waste it. So, I went back out. At first, everything seemed fine. The slopes were quiet, and the snow was perfect. But after a couple of runs, I started to feel like I was being watched. It's hard to explain, but you know the feeling when the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It was like that, this constant prickling sensation, like someone's eyes were on me. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was no one there. The trees were thick on either side of the trail, and every so often, I thought I saw movement, a shadow slipping between the trunks, just out of the corner of my eye. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe a tear. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Then, near the bottom of a run, I wiped out. I wasn't going fast, so I wasn't hurt, but when I got up, I noticed something weird. My ski had come loose again. When I looked closer, I realized the same binding I'd fixed the day before was loose again. The screw was still there, but it had been turned almost all the way out. Someone had tampered with it. I was done after that. I took my gear back to the lodge and went straight to Carol. I showed her the ski, told her about the note. She just looked at me, her face blank, and said, "I don't know what to tell you. Maybe you should take it easy for a day or two." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, crunching in the snow. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought whoever was out there would hear it. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I grabbed the only thing I could think of, a fire poker I'd seen leaning against the fireplace. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen, but after a few minutes, the footsteps started again, fading away into the night. In the morning, I found another note. This one was taped to the inside of the window, facing in. It said, "Leave now." That was it for me. I packed my stuff and went to the front desk to check out. Terrell wasn't there, just a handwritten note saying she'd be back later. I didn't care. I left the key on the counter and drove straight to the nearest town. On the way down the mountain, I noticed something in the rearview mirror, a black truck following me. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. The road was narrow, and there weren't many ways to get down. But the truck stayed behind me, no matter how fast or slow I went. When I got to town, I pulled into the parking lot of a gas station. The truck kept going, but as it passed, I saw the driver. He was wearing a ski mask. I stayed in town that night, at a cheap motel. The next morning, I called the lodge and tried to talk to Terrell, but no one answered. I thought about calling the police, but what could I tell them? Had someone left me creepy notes and messed with my skis? I still don't know who it was or what they wanted. All I know is that I'm never going back to that lodge, or anywhere near those mountains. I worked at a remote winter research station last year, one of those jobs where you spend months completely cut off from the rest of the world. It was just me and two other people, a guy named Jim and a woman named Elena. We were there to monitor weather patterns, take soil samples, and handle equipment maintenance. The station was small, just 3 cabins and a main lab building, surrounded by miles of snow and ice. It was the kind of cult that burns your skin if you didn't cover up properly, the kind that could kill you in minutes if you weren't careful. We arrived in early December, and everything started out fine. The work was routine, the days were short, and the nights were long. We spent most evenings in the main cabin, talking or playing cards. The isolation wasn't as bad as I'd expected. Then, sometime in mid-January, I started hearing the tapping. It was around 2 in the morning, and I just climbed into bed. The wind was howling outside, the way it always did at night, but underneath it, I heard this faint, rhythmic sound. Tap, tap, tap. I thought maybe it was a loose shutter or something knocking against the side of the cabin. The next morning, I checked. There was nothing near the walls, no branches or loose parts on the cabin. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me and tried to forget about it. But the tapping came back. It wasn't every night, and it wasn't at the same time, but when it happened, it was always the same. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. It sounded like it was coming from just outside my bedroom window. I mentioned it to Jim and Elena during breakfast one morning. Jim shrugged it off, said it was probably ice cracking or snow shifting against the building. But Elena looked at me funny, like she knew something I didn't. She didn't say anything, though, so I let it drop. A week later, the tapping got louder. It woke me up, and this time, it didn't stop after a few minutes. I got out of bed, grabbed my flashlight and went to the window. While I pulled back the curtain, all I saw was darkness and the reflection of my own face. I opened the window a crack and shined the flashlight outside. The beam cut through the snowstorm, but there was nothing there. Just snow piling up against the cabin wall and the endless white beyond. The next morning, I found tracks. They were faint, half filled with fresh snow, but they were definitely footprints. They started near the corner of the cabin and led off into the distance, disappearing into the trees. I called Jim and Elena over to show them. Jim frowned, crouching down to get a closer look. "Could be an animal," he said, but we both knew no animal around here would leave prints like that. Elena didn't say much, just stared at the tracks with a tight look on her face. Finally, she muttered, "It's too cold for anyone to be out there." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept listening for the tapping, but it didn't come. Instead, I started hearing something else, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps in the snow. They circled the cabin, slow and deliberate, stopping every so often before starting again. I stayed in bed, too scared to move, until the sound finally faded away. The next morning, I checked around the cabin again. The footprints were back, clearer this time. They circled the building and stopped just beneath my window. I told Jim and Elena again, but neither of them seemed to know what to do. Jim tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably a drifter or a hunter passing through. But there was no way anyone could survive out there in these temperatures, not without proper gear. Elena looked like she wanted to say something, but she stayed quiet. The next few days were tense. We stuck together as much as possible, walking to and from the lab in pairs and locking the doors behind us. The tapping and footsteps didn't come back, but the unease never left. Then, one night, I heard something different. It started as a low scratching sound, like nails striking across wood. It was coming from the front door. I grabbed a wrench from the bedside table and crept toward the noise. The scratching stopped as soon as I got close, but when I opened the door, there was no one there. Just the empty porch and the snow falling softly in the dark. I closed the door and locked it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, Jim was gone. His bed was unmade, his coat and boots were missing, and the front door was slightly ajar. We searched the entire station, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. Outside, we found a trail of footprints leading away from his cabin, heading toward the woods. Elena wanted to follow the tracks, but I stopped her. The snow was already starting to cover them, and I didn't want to risk getting lost out there. We radioed for help, but the storm was too strong. They said it would take at least 2 days for anyone to reach us. That night, Elena and I stayed in the main cabin together. We barricaded the doors and windows, sitting back to back in the center of the room. Neither of us slept. At some point in the early morning, we heard it again, the tapping. This time, it was at the main cabin door. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. Elena grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Don't open it," she whispered. I didn't plan to. The tapping continued for what felt like hours, growing louder and more insistent. Then it stopped, and the scratching began. It sounded like someone trying to claw their way inside. I gripped the wrench tighter, my heart pounding in my chest. Elena was trembling beside me, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. When the rescue team arrived 2 days later, they found Jim's body in the woods, half buried in snow. His coat and boots were gone, and his face was frozen in an expression of pure terror. They said he must have wandered off during the night, disoriented from the cold. But I know that's not true. Someone or something was out there. And whatever it was, it wanted us to know we weren't alone. It was late January, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you have on. My son, Tyler, was inside playing with his Legos, and I was outside shoveling the driveway. We'd gotten almost a foot of snow overnight, and it was still coming down in thick, heavy flakes. It wasn't the best time to do it, but if I didn't keep up with it, the whole driveway would be impossible to clear by morning. It was just me and Tyler. His dad left before he was born, so it's always been the two of us. We've lived in a quiet neighborhood, mostly older folks, the kind who wave when they see you but don't talk much beyond that. I liked it. It felt safe. That day, though, something felt off. I noticed it when I was halfway through shoveling. A car drove by slowly, so slow that I thought they might stop and ask for directions or something. It was an older sedan, dark blue, with windows so tinted I couldn't see inside. But they didn't stop. They just crawled past and then kept going down the block. I didn't think much of it at first. People drive slow in the snow, right? It's normal. But then, a few minutes later, the same car came back. It was unmistakable, the same deep tint, the same sluggish pace. This time, they slowed even more as they passed my house. I felt their headlights on me as I kept shoveling, trying not to look like I noticed. When they turned the corner again, my stomach twisted. I thought maybe I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. I stood there for a minute, leaning on the shovel, just staring at the street. The snow was coming down harder now, muffling everything. It was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. A few minutes passed, and the car didn't come back. I told myself to get a grip and went back to shoveling. But then I heard the crunch of tires on snow, faint but unmistakable. I looked up, and there it was again, the same car. It was coming from the other direction this time, creeping along like they were looking for something or someone. I don't know what it was, but something about the way they moved, so deliberate and slow, made my skin crawl. They didn't stop, but they didn't speed up either. They just kept going, disappearing around the bend at the end of the street. I dropped the shovel and went inside, locking the door behind me. Tyler looked up from the living room, his little face lighting up when he saw me. "Mom, are you done?" he asked, holding up a Lego tower he'd been working on. "Not yet, sweetie," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm just taking a break." I went to the front window and pulled the curtain back, just enough to see out. The street was empty, covered in fresh snow. No car, no movement, nothing. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined it, or that it wasn't as strange as it seemed. Maybe they were just lost, I told myself. Maybe they were looking for an address. But then the car came back. I saw it before I heard it this time, the dark shape emerging from the snowfall. They slowed down as they passed my house again, the tires crunching against the snowpack. My heart was pounding so hard I thought Tyler might hear it. I let the curtain drop and backed away from the window. My phone was in the kitchen, so I grabbed it and dialed 911, my hands shaky. I told the dispatcher what was happening, trying to keep my voice calm, but I must have sounded scared because she kept telling me to stay on the line. She said she'd send a patrol car to check the area. While I was on the phone, I heard the sound again. The car was outside, idling this time. I peeked out the window just enough to see the headlights cutting through the falling snow. They were parked right in front of my driveway, the engine running. My whole body went cold. The dispatcher asked me if I could see the driver, but I couldn't. The windows were too dark. I told her they weren't getting out of the car, just sitting there. She told me to stay inside, lock all the doors, and wait for the police. I hung up and grabbed Tyler, pulling him into the kitchen with me. "Mom, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice small and worried. "Nothing, sweetie," I said, forcing a smile. We're just going to stay in here for a little bit, okay? I heard the engine laugh, and when I peeked out again, the car was gone. The street was empty. I stayed by the window, watching, until I saw the red and blue lights of the patrol car coming down the block. I ran outside, waving them down. The officer was a young guy, probably in his 20s. I told him everything, about how the car had been circling and how it stopped in front of my house. He nodded, taking notes, and said he'd drive around to see if he could spot them. He gave me his card and told me to call if they came back. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard the sound of tires on snow, that slow, deliberate crunch. But the car didn't come back, and by morning, I started to believe it was over. 2 days later, I found footprints in the snow outside my living room window. They weren't mine, and they weren't Tyler's. They led from the sidewalk to the window, stopped there, and then turned back toward the street. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the snow had started to melt, and the tracks were fading. That was the last straw. I packed up Tyler and we stayed with my sister for a week. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was in that car had been watching us, and I didn't want to stick around to find out why. When we came back, I had a security system installed, cameras and everything. I never saw the car again, but sometimes, late at night, I think I hear that sound, the slow crunch of tires on snow. It's probably just my imagination, but I always check the window, just in case. Yeah. The train station was almost empty. Snow was coming down hard, the kind of storm that makes it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I had been waiting for hours already, hoping the delayed train would finally show up. The wind cut through every layer of clothing I had on, and even in the small waiting room, the cold seeped into the walls. There were a few other people around, just enough to feel like I wasn't completely alone, but not enough to make it any less eerie. One woman with a suitcase sat in the corner, staring at her phone. A couple of guys were slouched on the benches near the door, talking quietly. And then there was the man on the far end of the platform. At first, I didn't think much about him. He was standing by himself, bundled up in a long coat and scarf, his hood pulled low over his face. He looked like anyone else waiting for the train, but something about the way he stood there bothered me. He wasn't pacing or checking his phone like everyone else. He was completely still, just standing there with his hands in his pockets. When I looked over at him again, I realized he was staring at me. I turned away quickly, pretending I hadn't noticed, but it unsettled me. I kept telling myself there was nothing. People stare sometimes without realizing it. Maybe he wasn't even looking at me. But every time I glanced back, his head was still turned in my direction. He didn't move, didn't shift his weight, didn't look away. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore and decided to go back inside the waiting room. It wasn't much warmer, but at least it felt less exposed. I found a seat where I could still see the platform through the window. The man was still out there, still staring. The snow was piling up around him, but he didn't seem to notice, or everyone else had either gone inside or left. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone, but I kept glancing up at the window. He was still there. He hadn't moved an inch. Finally, the train pulled into the station. The sound of it was almost a relief, breaking the silence that had been pressing down on me all night. I grabbed my bag and joined the small group of passengers heading for the doors. When I stepped outside, the cold hit me like a wall, and I hurried to get on board. As I climbed the steps, I looked back over my shoulder. The man was walking toward the train now, his pace steady and deliberate. I didn't see him carry a bag or a ticket, but I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe he just didn't have much luggage. I found a seat near the middle of the car, next to a window. The train was quiet, with only a handful of people scattered throughout. I sat down, trying to shake off the unease that had been building all night. The man walked into the car a few moments later. He didn't sit down right away. Instead, he stood near the entrance, looking around like he was deciding where to go. Then he started walking down the aisle, his footsteps slow and heavy on the floor. He passed by several empty seats before stopping a few rows behind me. I couldn't see him without turning around, but I could feel his presence, the way you can tell when someone's watching you even if you can't see them. I tried to ignore it, staring out the window at the snow-covered landscape rushing by. The train moved steadily through the storm, the rhythmic sound of the wheels on the tracks almost soothing. But every so often, I caught a glimpse of his reflection in the glass. He was still sitting there, still watching. The ride felt endless. I kept telling myself that as long as I stayed in my seat and didn't react, everything would be fine. Maybe he wasn't even watching me. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him get up. He walked slowly down the aisle, his footsteps louder than they should have been in the quiet car. I tensed up, gripping the armrests of my seat, but he didn't stop. He walked right past me and into the next car. I let out a shaky breath, trying to convince myself that it was over. He was gone. But something told me not to relax just yet. I kept my bag close and stayed alert, watching the door to the next car. Minutes passed, and he didn't come back. I started to think maybe I had overreacted. When the train pulled into the next station, a few people got off. I thought about leaving too, but it was late, and I didn't want to get stranded in another unfamiliar place. I stayed in my seat, hoping the rest of the ride would be uneventful. But then I saw him again. He was standing on the platform, just outside the window. I don't know how he got off the train without me noticing, but there he was, staring up at me through the glass. His hood was still pulled low, and his face was shadowed, but I could see enough to know it was him. He didn't move, didn't try to get back on the train. He just stood there, watching as the doors closed and the train pulled away. I didn't see him again after that. The rest of the ride was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, watching. When I finally got to my stop, I practically ran off the train and into the station. It wasn't until I was in a cab, heading home, that I started to feel safe again. Even now, I can't explain what happened. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. But every time I think about that night, I can still feel his eyes on me, unblinking, in the middle of that snowstorm. When I first moved to the town, it seemed like the kind of quiet I had been looking for. It was small, just a few rows of houses along a single main road, with a general store, a diner, and not much else. I rented a little place at the edge of the woods, away from most of the others. The idea was to spend the winter there, focus on my writing, and enjoy the solitude. The house was all but cozy, and the snow made everything look peaceful. At first, I loved it. The only sounds were the wind through the trees and the crunch of snow under my boots when I went out to grab firewood. But then, after a few weeks, I noticed something that didn't sit right. I had gone out to shovel the driveway one morning after a fresh snowfall. The snow was untouched, clean and even, except for one set of footprints leading from my back door out into the woods. They weren't mine. I hadn't gone out back since the storm, and I lived alone. The prints were deep, the kind that only boots make. I stared at them for a while, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I hadn't locked the door, and someone had wandered in during the night. But nothing in the house seemed out of place. I thought maybe it was some kind of prank. Kids, maybe. But there weren't many kids in town, and none lived nearby. I followed the tracks to where the trees started. They didn't stop there. They kept going deeper into the woods until I couldn't see them anymore. I didn't go after them. It didn't seem like a good idea. Instead, I went back inside and checked the locks. The back door had been latched. I know it was locked the night before. I didn't mention it to anyone that day, but it stayed in my mind. A couple of days later, I stopped by the diner in town for some coffee and decided to ask one of the waitresses about it. She was middle-aged, kind-looking, and had been friendly the first time I came in. I told her about the footprints, how they had started at my door and led into the woods. She didn't say anything for a second, just stared at me like she was trying to figure out if I was joking. Then she said, "Must have been a hunter." I told her I hadn't seen any hunters around and didn't think anyone had been out there. She shrugged and said, "It's that time of year," before walking off to refill someone's coffee. It felt like she didn't want to talk about it. Later that day, I stopped at the general store to pick up some supplies and brought it up again. This time, I asked the guy behind the counter if people in town hunted in the woods near my place. He looked at me for a long time before saying, "Not much came out there anymore." Then he handed me my change and didn't say anything else. It started to feel like everyone in town knew something I didn't. No one would really talk about it, but the way they looked at me made me feel like I'd said something I shouldn't have. A week went by, and I tried to forget about it. The snow kept falling, and I stayed busy with my writing. But every morning, I checked the back door, and every morning, the snow around it was undisturbed. I thought maybe it had been a one-time thing, something harmless. Then it happened again. I had just gotten up and was making coffee when I noticed the footprints through the kitchen window. They started at the back door and disappeared into the woods, just like before. I went out to look at them. They were fresh, still crisp around the edges. Whoever it was had been there sometime during the night. I called the local sheriff that time. He came out that afternoon, a big man in his 50s with a thick jacket and a slow way of talking. I showed him the footprints and told him what had happened the first time. He nodded, asked a few questions, and walked around the property for a while. When he came back, he said, "Probably someone passing through. Maybe someone camping out in the woods." I told him it didn't make sense. The footprints started at my door. It was like they had come out of my house, not gone into it. He looked at me for a second before saying, "I'll keep an eye out." Then he left. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the sheriff and the way he hadn't really answered my questions. Around midnight, I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, just a soft crunching sound, like someone walking on the snow. I turned off the lights and looked out the window, but I couldn't see anything. The next morning, the footprints were there again. This time, I noticed something else. The snow around the prints was disturbed, like whoever it was had stood there for a long time before heading into the woods. It made my skin crawl. I decided to ask one of the neighbors about it. There weren't many people living near me, but there was an older couple down the road who had been there for years. I walked over that afternoon and knocked on their door. The wife answered, and I told her about the footprints. Her face went pale as I talked. She didn't say much, just nodded and listened. While I was done, she said, "You should lock your doors at night." I told her I always did, but it didn't seem to make a difference. She hesitated, then said, "If I were you, I'd think about staying somewhere else." That was the last thing I wanted to hear. I asked her why, but she just shook her head and said, Sometimes it's better not to ask too many questions. I left feeling worse than before. That night, I stayed up late, listening for any sounds outside. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the crunching sound, closer this time. I didn't look out the window. I was too scared. Instead, I sat there in the dark, holding my phone and wondering if I should call the sheriff again. The sound stopped after a while, but I couldn't sleep. When the sun came up, I went outside to check. The footprints were there, leading from the back door into the woods. But this time, there was something else. Just outside the door, in the snow, was a single glove. It was black, worn-looking, and too big to be mine. I didn't stay after that. I packed a bag and drove to a motel in the next town over. I didn't even bother locking the door behind me. I haven't been back since. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, and I don't think I want to know. All I know is that the town wasn't as quiet as it seemed, and some questions are better left unanswered. I decided to spend a weekend ice fishing alone. It was something I'd done plenty of times before, but this time felt different. The weather had been bad, with heavy snowstorms hitting earlier that week, but by Saturday morning, the sky was clear. The cold didn't bother me much. I liked the quiet out there on the ice. The lake I chose was about an hour from my house, surrounded by nothing but woods. In the winter, it turned into a wide expanse, just ice and snow stretching as far as you could see. I set up my hut near the middle of the lake, not too close to the shore but far enough from where I had parked my truck. The ice was thick enough for safety, and I could see a few other huts scattered around, but not many. Most people weren't out that day, maybe because of how bad the weather had been earlier. The first few hours were uneventful. I caught a couple of small fish and drank some coffee from my thermos to keep warm. The wind was strong, making the walls of my hut flap every so often, but it wasn't bad enough to bother me. I liked being out there alone. Around mid-afternoon, I saw someone waving from a distance. At first, I thought it was just someone being friendly. The hut was maybe 100 yards away, and the figure stood outside, raising an arm and lowering it again. It didn't look frantic, just slow, like they were trying to get my attention. I waved back but didn't think much of it. Sometimes people did that, just acknowledging another person on the ice. But they didn't stop. The arm kept going up and down, deliberate, like they really wanted me to come over. I put down my rod and stepped outside for a better look. The person was wearing a heavy jacket and a knit cap, and I could just make out the outline of their body against the white backdrop. They weren't moving other than the waving. The closer I looked, the stranger it felt. Most people out here wouldn't leave their hut for long, it was too cold for that. But this person didn't seem to care about the cold or even what they were doing. They just stood there, waving. I thought maybe something was wrong. They might have been stuck or hurt, so I decided to go over. I grabbed my coat, slipped on my gloves, and started walking toward their hut. It wasn't far, but the wind was picking up, cutting across the ice and making it hard to see. I kept my eyes on them as I walked, but something felt off. They didn't move from the spot. They just stood there, still waving. I shouted out to ask if they were okay, but the wind carried my voice away, and they didn't respond. As I got closer, maybe 20 or 30 yards out, I realized I couldn't see their face. The hood of their jacket was pulled down low, and the light was strange, making it hard to see any features. I slowed down, suddenly unsure if I wanted to get any closer. Then they stopped waving. They stood there for a moment, completely still. My boots crunched on the ice, and the sound felt too loud, too sharp against the quiet. I called out again, asking if they needed help. No answer. Before I could get closer, the person turned and walked toward the hut. It was slow, not hurried, like they knew I would follow. My first thought was that maybe they were injured or too cold to speak, so I kept going. The hut was just ahead now, and I could see the door hanging slightly open. I stepped up to it and knocked on the frame. No answer. I called out again, saying I was coming in, and pushed the door wider. Inside, the hut was empty. There was no one there. Just an overturned chair and some scattered fishing gear on the floor. A hole had been drilled in the ice, but the line wasn't in the water. The place looked abandoned, but it didn't make sense. I had just seen someone walk inside. Then I noticed the blood. It wasn't much at first, just a few dark drops near the hole. But when I looked closer, I saw more. A thin trail led from the chair to the door I had just walked through, like someone had been bleeding and moved outside. The snow near the hut was disturbed, the footprints messy and scattered, but they led away from the door, out toward the far edge of the lake. My first thought was that the person had gotten hurt and gone to get help. But there was no truck parked on the ice, and the nearest road was miles away. There was no way anyone could walk out of there in that condition. I stood there, trying to make sense of it, but the longer I looked at the trail, the more uneasy I felt. The footprints weren't consistent. They started clear, but then they changed, like whoever it was that started dragging one foot were crawling. The blood drops grew heavier the farther they went. I wanted to leave. The whole thing felt wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I turned back toward my own hut, but before I could take a step, I heard a sound behind me, coming from the woods at the edge of the lake. It was faint at first, a crunching noise like something moving through the snow. I stopped and listened, my breath clouding in the air. The sound came again, closer this time, and I realized it wasn't just one set of footsteps. There were multiple, coming from the direction of the blood trail. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and started running back toward my hut, the cold air burning my lungs. My boots slipped on the ice, and I nearly fell, but I kept going. Behind me, the crunching grew louder, faster, like whatever was out there was following me. When I reached my hut, I didn't stop. I grabbed my gear, threw it into my sled, and started toward my truck. The wind was biting, and the sled kept catching on the uneven ice, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. By the time I reached the truck, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the lock. I climbed in, started the engine, and peeled out onto the road, not caring about the ice or the conditions. I just wanted to get away. I don't know what I saw out there or what happened to the person who had been waving at me. I thought about going back, trying to figure it out, but every time I do, I remember that sound, the crunching footsteps closing in, and I can't bring myself to do it. Whatever happened on that lake, I don't think I want to know. When I signed up for the winter shift at the remote research station, I thought I knew what I was getting into. It wasn't my first time working somewhere isolated. The pay was good, and I liked the solitude. The station was tucked away in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by snow and ice in every direction. There were only 3 of us stationed there, me, Craig, and Linda, and we worked in shifts. Craig and Linda were on the other side of the site, a good 2 miles from my cabin and supply shed. It was far enough that we didn't see each other much, just radio check-ins every day. The first few weeks were fine. The routine was boring, but that was part of the job. Every morning, I do inventory in the supply shed, check the logs, and make sure everything was where it should be. The supplies were critical out there. Food, tools, fuel, losing anything could be a serious problem. The first time I noticed something missing, I didn't think much of it. A can of soup. I figured I must have misplaced it or forgotten to log it. Stuff like that happens when you're alone for long stretches. Your mind plays tricks on you. But the next day, more was gone. This time, it was a package of instant oatmeal and a screwdriver from my toolkit. I started to feel uneasy. I knew I hadn't used the screwdriver. I checked the logs again to see if Craig or Linda had come by and borrowed anything, but nothing was recorded. I radioed Craig to ask if he'd stop by, and he sounded confused. He said no, and when I asked Linda later, she said the same thing. They were too far away to swing by casually without letting me know. I tried to brush it off, but I double-checked the locks on the supply shed that night. The next morning, the lock was broken. It wasn't smashed, just scratched and dented, like someone had forced it open with a tool. Inside, more supplies were gone. A few cans of food, a flashlight, and some batteries. This time, I knew I hadn't misplaced anything. Someone was stealing from me. I radioed Craig and Linda again, this time with more urgency. Craig sounded annoyed, saying they hadn't left their side of the site in days. Linda backed him up, and I believed them. They were always clear about locking any trips or sharing supplies, and they had no reason to lie. But if it wasn't them, then who? We were completely alone out there. The nearest town was hours away, and the snowstorms that week made travel almost impossible. The roads leading to the site were buried under several feet of snow. Nobody could have gotten in without leaving tracks, and I hadn't seen any. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind outside was howling, shaking the cabin, and every creak of the floorboards set me on edge. I kept thinking about the shed, wondering if whoever it was would come back. Around midnight, I heard a faint crunching sound outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind shifting the snow, but it didn't stop. It was slow and deliberate, like footsteps. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. The beam cut through the darkness, but I didn't see anything at first. The crunching stopped as soon as I stepped outside. I scanned the area, my breath fogging up in the freezing air, but there was nothing, just the snow-covered landscape and the supply shed in the distance. I told myself it was nothing, maybe an animal, and went back inside. The next morning, there were footprints outside the cabin. They were fresh, leading from the edge of the woods to the supply shed and then back toward my cabin. They didn't look like Craig or Linda's boots. They were smaller, like someone else entirely. The thought made my stomach turn. Whoever it was had come right up to the cabin and stood outside the door. The snow was disturbed in a pattern like they'd been pacing or waiting for something. I followed the footprints as far as I could, but they disappeared into the woods, where the snow was too packed down to see any clear trail. I didn't go any farther. I didn't want to. Why I radioed Craig and Linda, I didn't mention the footprints. I didn't know why, but something about saying it out loud felt wrong. I just told them I was going to keep my gear locked inside the cabin from now on and see if that stopped whoever it was. They didn't ask questions, and I was glad for it. That night, I woke up to a loud bang. It sounded like something had hit the side of the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight and my crowbar, my heart pounding. The sound came again, this time closer to the window. I crept toward it, trying to keep my breathing steady. When I peeked out, I saw movement, a shadow darting past the edge of the light. I swung the door open and stepped out, shining the flashlight toward the shed. The door was open again, swinging slightly in the wind. I walked over, gripping the crowbar tight, and pushed the door wider. The inside was a mess. Supplies were scattered everywhere, cans rolling on the floor, and one of the shelves had been knocked over. Then I heard it, breathing. It was shallow and uneven, coming from behind the knocked-over shelf. I froze, my grip tightening on the crowbar. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no answer, but the breathing stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. I stepped back slowly, my flashlight darting around the room, and then bolted for the cabin. I locked the door behind me and didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, the snowstorm had picked up again, covering the footprints and any sign of what had happened. I radioed Craig and Linda, my voice shaking as I told them everything. Craig said he'd come over to check it out, but it would take him a while to get through the snow. When Craig arrived, he didn't find anything in the shed except the mess. No sign of anyone hiding, no footprints, nothing. He looked at me like I was losing it, but I didn't care. I told him I was leaving. I wasn't going to wait around to see what would happen next. I packed my things and drove out as soon as the snow let up enough to clear the roads. I didn't tell anyone else what happened. I didn't want to think about it anymore. But every so often, I wonder who or what was out there with me, and if they're still there now, waiting for the next person to come along. I went up to the cabin to get away from everything for a while. It belonged to my family, but no one had been up there for years. It sat at the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by thick trees. Winters there were harsh, and the isolation was part of why I liked it. I figured a week alone would help clear my head. The place was quiet, and the snow muffled everything. It felt like I was in a different world. When I got there, the cabin looked just as I remembered it. The snow was deep, and I had to shovel a path to the door. Everything inside was cold and smelled stale, but it was still solid, windows intact, doors locked, no sign of animals getting in. I got the fire going and unpacked my stuff, settling in for the night. The first night was normal. It was so quiet I could hear the creak of the wood as the cabin warmed up. I didn't even bother locking the doors. No one was around for miles, and the snow was so heavy it seemed impossible for anyone to get there without me noticing. I slept well, only waking once when the wind picked up and riled the windows. The next morning, I stepped outside to check the wood pile and stopped cold. There were footprints in the snow. They circled the cabin, close to the walls, like someone had walked around it slowly. At first, I thought they might be mine from the night before, but they weren't. They were fresher, and I hadn't gone anywhere near the back of the cabin. They were also smaller than my boots. Someone else had been there. I stood there for a long time, just staring at them. The tracks led off toward the trees, but after a few yards, they disappeared into the snow. The wind must have covered them, I thought. Still, it didn't sit right with me. Who would be out there in the middle of nowhere? I told myself it was probably a hunter or a hiker, but it didn't make sense. There was no car, no snowmobile, no sign of anyone else arriving. Just the prints. I went back inside and locked the doors, which I should have done in the first place. I spent the day trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting. But that night, I couldn't relax. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone looking in. I even checked the locks twice before going to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night to a faint tapping sound. It was soft at first, just a few knocks, then nothing. I sat up, holding my breath, trying to figure out where it was coming from. A few minutes later, it happened again, 3 quiet taps, this time on the window near the kitchen. I got up and grabbed the flashlight. My heart was racing as I moved toward the window. I stood to the side and slowly shined the light outside, but I didn't see anything. The snow was falling hard, and the wind was blowing, so I told myself it must have been a branch or something loose hitting the glass. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I checked outside. The footprints were back. They were the same size as before, circling the cabin again, but this time they were closer to the windows. The snow around the kitchen window was disturbed, like someone had been standing there for a while. My stomach dropped. I followed the tracks as far as I could, but they led into the trees again and vanished. It was like whoever it was didn't leave, just stayed close to the cabin. I thought about leaving, but the snowstorm was worse, and the roads would be impossible to drive on. I convinced myself it was just someone messing around, maybe a prank, and they'd leave me alone if I ignored it. That night, the knocking came back, louder this time. It moved from window to window, slow and deliberate. I sat in the dark, clutching a flashlight and a kitchen knife. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. I crept to the living room window and peeked out from the side. There was nothing but snow and darkness. Then, the knocking came from the back door. It wasn't soft anymore, it was steady and forceful, like someone was trying to get in. I froze, my mind racing. I yelled out, "Who's there?" but there was no answer. The knocking stopped, and the silence was worse. I stayed awake until dawn, listening to every creak and sound. When the sun finally came up, I checked the door. The snow around it was packed down, like someone had been standing there for a long time. The footprints circled the cabin again, but this time, there were more of them. It wasn't just one set anymore. I decided I couldn't stay. The storm had eased up, and I didn't care if the roads were bad, I just wanted to get out. I packed my things as fast as I could, keeping an eye on the windows the whole time. Before I left, I went outside to check one last thing. The footprints didn't lead back to the woods this time. They stopped at the edge of the cabin, right where the trailing began. I looked around, heart pounding, and that's when I saw it, something glinting in the snow. It was a small, broken piece of glass. It looked like it came from a flashlight. I didn't wait to figure out what it meant. I got in my truck and drove, fishtailing on the icy road but not stopping. When I finally reached the main highway, I pulled over and called the sheriff's department. They said they'd send someone to check the property, but I never went back to find out if they did. To this day, I don't know who it was or what they wanted. All I know is that someone, or more than one, was out there, watching me, waiting. Well, except that cool. Boy. I moved out to the ranch a couple of years ago. I wanted quiet, somewhere I didn't have to deal with people every day. The winters here are hard, but I was used to it. This year, the snow started earlier than usual, heavy and constant, so by December, the roads were already impossible to drive on. I had stocked up, though. I had enough supplies to last me until spring if I needed. The barn was about 50 yards from my house, across a stretch of open snow. I kept the horses there and sometimes stored equipment I couldn't fit in the main shed. I wasn't expecting anyone to show up, let alone in the middle of a storm, so when I saw the tracks leading from the road to the barn that morning, I stopped dead in my tracks. The snow was still coming down, but the tracks were fresh, deep, heavy boot prints. They led straight into the barn. I stood there for a second, just staring. My mind started working through explanations. Maybe someone had gotten stranded, I thought. Maybe it was a neighbor who needed help. But the closest neighbor was miles away, and no one ever came out this far. I grabbed my shotgun before heading over. It wasn't loaded, but it was enough to make someone think twice that they were up to no good. The wind was howling, and the cold bit into my face as I trudged through the snow. While I pushed the barn door open, I stopped again. There was a man standing near the stalls. He was tall, bundled in layers, with a thick scarf covering most of his face. His gloves were worn and patched, and his boots were caked with snow. He didn't look surprised to see me. If anything, he seemed like he'd been waiting. "Truck broke down," he said. His voice was muffled behind the scarf. "Needed to get out of the wind." I tightened my grip on the shotgun. "Well, there's no truck out there," I said. I hadn't seen one, not even tire tracks on the road. "It's farther down," he said. He didn't move, just stood there, staring at me. His eyes were dark, almost black, and didn't blink much. Didn't want to freeze walking back. Something about him made my stomach twist. He didn't look panicked or cold. He looked calm, too calm for someone stranded in a storm. "You can't stay here," I said. "There's a town about 10 miles east. If you head that way, you'll find someone to help." He didn't respond right away. He just tilted his head a little, like he was considering something. Then he said, "Roads are bad. Can't walk that far." "You can't stay here," I repeated. My voice came out sharper than I meant. I wasn't sure what else to say. He was taller than me, broader, and I wasn't about to let him get any closer. He didn't argue, but he didn't leave either. He took a step toward me, slow and deliberate, and I raised a shotgun. "Don't," I said. My hands were shaking, but I kept the barrel pointed at his chest. That made him stop. He raised his hands, palms out, like he wanted to show he wasn't a threat. "All right," he said. "All right. I'll go." I stayed where I was, watching him as he walked out of the barn. He moved slow, like he had all the time in the world. Well, he turned once, just before stepping into the snow, and his eyes met mine again. There was something behind them I couldn't read, something that made my skin crawl. Then he was gone, his figure swallowed by the storm. I stood there for a long time, waiting to see if he'd come back. When I finally went back to the house, I locked every door and window, something I didn't usually bother with out here. I kept the shotgun close, just in case. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made me sit up, listening. The wind slammed against the windows, and the old wood of the house groaned under the weight of the snow. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch, but when I checked, there was nothing there. In the morning, I found new tracks around the barn. They weren't mine. They circled the building, stopping at the door and the windows, like someone had been watching from every angle. I followed them back toward the road, but they didn't lead anywhere. They just stopped. I tried to tell myself he'd left, but he was gone for good. But I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't alone. That night, I heard something again, a faint tapping at the kitchen window. It was slow and steady, like someone testing the glass. I didn't turn the lights on. I didn't want whoever or whatever it was to know where I was. I stayed in the dark, clutching the shotgun and staring at the window until the tapping stopped. When it did, I heard footsteps crunching through the snow, moving away from the house. I didn't sleep. The next day, I decided I couldn't wait for the storm to clear. I packed what I could into the truck and tried to leave. The snow was deep, but the engine turned over, and I managed to back out of the driveway. I thought I was in the clear until I reached the main road and saw something lying in the middle of it. It was a bundle of cloth, torn and stained dark. I couldn't tell what it was at first, but as I got closer, I saw the scarf the man had been wearing, twisted and frozen in the snow. There was no sign of him, just the scarf and a patch of disturbed snow leading into the trees. I didn't stop to look closer. I drove straight to town and didn't look back. When I told the sheriff what happened, he said he'd send someone to check the property, but I didn't stick around to find out what they found. I haven't been back since. I wasn't planning on hiking that day. The weather report said there was a storm coming, but I'd been stuck inside for 3 days straight, and I couldn't take it anymore. The cabin was small, just a rental for a few weeks, and being cooped up like that made me feel like I was losing my mind. I thought if I stayed close to the trail, I'd be fine. I wasn't going to go far, just enough to stretch my legs and get some fresh air. The snow started falling harder about an hour in. The wind picked up, blowing flakes sideways, and I thought about turning back. I'd brought my coat, gloves, and boots, but I wasn't as prepared as I should have been. Still, the trail was marked well, and I thought I'd be able to find my way even if the storm got worse. I told myself I'd hike for another 10 minutes, then head back. That's when I saw it, the campsite. It wasn't far off the trail, tucked in a small clearing surrounded by trees. At first, I thought it was just another hiker, someone who'd gotten there before the storm hit. But as I got closer, something felt wrong. The tent was collapsed, sagging under a thin layer of snow, and there was no sign of anyone around. I should have kept walking. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I thought someone might be hurt. Either way, I stepped off the trail and into the clearing. The snow was deep, almost to my knees, and every step felt heavy. When I reached the tent, I saw it wasn't just collapsed, it was torn. The fabric was ripped down the side, like someone had slashed it with a knife. The stakes were still in the ground, but the poles were snapped in half. There was a backpack lying nearby, half buried in the snow. It looked like it had been rifled through, the zippers open and the contents spilled out. A sleeping bag was crumpled a few feet away, white and stiff from the cold. I called out, but no one answered. The wind held through the trees, drowning out my voice. That's when I saw the blood. At first, it was just a few drops in the snow, small and dark, but as I followed the trail, it got worse. The stains were smeared, like something had been dragged. They led away from the campsite, deeper into the forest, and my stomach turned as I looked at them. I thought about going back to the cabin, calling for help, but I knew it would take hours for anyone to get there in this weather. If someone was hurt, they might not have that long. So I followed the trail. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking, though I told myself that was the right thing to do. The trees grew thicker as I walked, the branches closing in overhead and blocking out what little light was left. The snow muffled everything, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots and the wind. The trail of blood led to a small ravine, where the ground tipped sharply and the trees opened up again. At the bottom, I saw something lying in the snow. It was a jacket, bright red, torn and stained. I thought it might be the person who owned the campsite, but when I got closer, I realized it was empty. Just the jacket, half buried, with more blood pulled around it. There were more tracks in the snow, leading away from the jacket, and I noticed something strange. The footprints weren't from boots. They were bare feet, wide and deep, like someone had been running without shoes. I felt sick. I wanted to turn back, to leave and pretend I hadn't seen anything, but I couldn't. I kept going, my breath coming in short bursts as I pushed through the snow. The tracks led to a fallen tree, where I found another piece of clothing, a scarf, this time, knotted and frozen. More blood, smeared across the bark of the tree. The tracks didn't stop. They just kept going, weaving through the trees, and I realized whoever it was had been running in circles. There were overlapping trails, leading back and forth, like they'd been trying to lose something or someone. I don't know how long I followed the tracks. It felt like hours, but it was probably less. The storm was getting worse, and the wind was so loud I couldn't hear anything else. Then I saw it, just ahead, between the trees. A figure, standing still in the snow. At first, I thought it was a person I'd been following, but one who'd left the tracks. I called out, but they didn't move. I stepped closer, my boots sinking into the snow, and I realized it wasn't a person at all. It was a pile of branches and snow, shaped to look like a person. Someone had built it, carefully arranged to stand upright, with a torn piece of fabric tied around the top like a scarf. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps behind me, crunching in the snow. I turned so fast I almost fell, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no one there. Just the trees, swaying in the wind, and the faint helpline of my own tracks leading back the way I'd come. I didn't wait. I started running, back toward the trail, back toward the cabin. The storm was so thick now I could barely see a few feet in front of me, but I didn't care. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they were going to burst. When I finally saw the cabin, I nearly collapsed. I locked the door and pushed a chair against it, then sat in the corner with a knife in my hand. I stayed there all night, listening to the wind and waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The next morning, the storm had cleared. I packed up my things and left. I didn't tell anyone what I saw, not the ranger station, not the locals. I didn't think they'd believe me, and to be honest, I didn't want to talk about it. I just wanted to get out of there. I don't know what happened at that campsite, or who left the tracks in the snow. I don't know if they were running from someone, or if they were the one chasing. All I know is that I'll never go back to that forest again. It all started one cold, winter morning, the kind where the snow had been coming down for hours, thick and heavy, coating everything in a soft white blanket. I woke up early that day, just like I always did. The house was quiet, and there was something peaceful about the sound of the wind blowing through the trees outside. I brewed my coffee and stared out the kitchen window, watching the snow fall. It was still dark outside, just after dawn, but I had work to do, and I needed to get moving. I had a small farm on the edge of town, and most days, I was by myself. I didn't mind it. I liked the quiet, the solitude. There was always something that needed attention, whether it was feeding the animals, clearing snow, or making sure everything was in order for the coming winter storms. I'd been living there for a few years, and aside from a few neighbors who lived a few miles away, I didn't interact much with anyone. I liked it that way. When I got to my car, parked in the driveway, I noticed something strange right away. A piece of paper was tucked under the windshield wiper. At first, I thought it was just a flyer or something, but as I walked closer, I saw it was a folded note, the edges of it stained with the snow. I hesitated for a second. It wasn't like me to find random notes on my car. But I shrugged it off, figuring it was just a prank or someone trying to get my attention. Maybe one of the neighbors had left it for me, though I couldn't imagine why. Still, I reached for it and unfolded it. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic, and the words were short, to the point, "Lock the barn door before sundown." I stood there in the snow, staring at the note. I read it over and over, thinking maybe I was missing something. My first thought was that it was some kind of mistake, maybe someone had left it for the wrong person. But then I realized that no one but me would have known I even had a barn. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and none of them ever really came by. I thought about it for a minute, trying to make sense of it. Was it a joke? Maybe someone had been messing with me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. The note felt urgent, like a warning, and there was something unsettling about it. I shrugged it off, though. It could have just been some weird thing someone thought was funny. I didn't have time to dwell on it. I had work to do. I spent most of the morning clearing snow around the house, making sure the paths were clear and everything was in order. But the note kept nagging at the back of my mind. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. By the time afternoon rolled around, I'd almost forgotten about it. The snow had stopped falling, and the sun had come out, casting a soft glow over everything. I walked outside to check the animals, make sure they were all fed and settled in for the night. The barn was just across the yard from my house, a little ways down the hill. It was a sturdy, old building, nothing fancy, but it did the job. I stored hay in there, kept the animals inside when the weather got bad, and kept tools and equipment. It was never anything too special, just a part of the farm. But the note came back to me, uninvited, as I walked toward the barn. Locked the barn door before sundown. I stopped in my tracks. It was almost sunset, and the shadows were stretching long across the ground. The thought of locking the barn door seemed so odd. I'd never locked it before. It didn't make sense. Why would I? No one ever came by that way, and nothing had ever happened to make me feel like I needed to lock it. But still, there was that nagging feeling. I felt an unease in the pit of my stomach, like someone was watching me, though there was no one in sight. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. I stood there in the snow, staring at the barn. Something in my gut told me I should go inside and lock the door. The idea of not doing it, of just ignoring the note, felt wrong. I don't know why, but I felt like something bad would happen if I didn't. So, I went inside. The air inside the barn was cold and musty, smelling of hay and wood. The door was as I left it, nothing out of the ordinary, but I made sure to lock it anyway, just as the note said. I felt ridiculous, locking a door I'd never locked before, but something about the whole situation was giving me chills. Maybe I was overthinking it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here recently, that something wasn't right. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every noise outside made me jump, and I kept hearing things that didn't make sense, the faint sound of footsteps in the snow, the creak of the floorboards when I was sure no one was around. I tried to tell myself it was the wind or the owls settling, but I knew it was more than that. The whole day had felt off, and the note still weighed on me. The next morning, I got up early and decided to go out and check the barn again. I wasn't sure why, but I felt like I had to. I half expected the door to be unlocked, but when I got there, everything was exactly as I'd left it. I couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. But then I noticed something. The footprints in the snow, leading up to the barn. They weren't mine. And they didn't look fresh, not from the snowstorm the night before. They were older, and they led right up to the door. My heart sank. I'd locked the barn door, but someone had been here. Someone had been in my yard, in the snow, just the night before. I don't know who it was or why they left the note. Maybe I'll never know. But after that day, I made sure to always lock that barn door. Even now, years later, I never leave it unlocked, no matter what. Something about that note, about the feeling that came with it, never really left me. I always wondered if I had been just one step away from something much worse. It It was one of those long, miserable winter nights. The kind where the snow just doesn't stop falling, and the wind howls so loud that it feels like it's trying to tear the roof off. I had been driving for hours, trying to get to a small town just to get some laughs before finishing my trip the next morning. I didn't expect the storm to hit as hard as it did, but by the time I reached the motel, I could barely see out the windshield. The place wasn't much, just a rundown building on the edge of town, but it was the only spot I could find. I didn't have much choice. I parked and made my way into the lobby, where an older guy behind the counter checked me in. He didn't say much, just handed me the key with a nod and pointed to the room. "Room 7, he muttered. "Lock up, and stay warm. Bad storm coming in." I was too tired to care about small talk, so I just grabbed the key and went to my room. The wind outside riled the windows, and the snow kept coming down thick, but the room was warm, at least. I set my bags down, took a quick shower, and then decided to head back to the lobby for a cup of coffee. The storm was getting worse, and I figured it'd be nice to have a little more time before I had to deal with the road again the next morning. I left my room and made my way back to the lobby. It wasn't far, just a short walk down the hallway. The place was quiet, like most motels in the middle of nowhere, especially in the dead of winter. The old man was sitting at the desk, watching something on TV. He barely looked up when I walked in, just nodded and muttered something about the weather. I didn't stay long, maybe 15 or 20 minutes. I wasn't in the mood for conversation, and the coffee wasn't anything to write home about. I figured I'd head back to my room, get some sleep, and deal with the snowstorm in the morning. While I walked back into the room, everything seemed fine at first. It was exactly as I had left it, bed made, bags still on the floor, nothing out of place. But then I saw it. There was a black glove sitting on the bed. I froze. My first thought was that maybe I'd left it there when I left a room, but I knew that wasn't possible. I didn't wear gloves. Not that kind, anyway. The glove was thin, leather, and clearly belonged to someone else. I had never seen it before, and I hadn't noticed it when I walked in. I took a step closer, my mind racing. Who would come in here? I hadn't heard anyone, and the only person in the building was the old guy behind the desk. Maybe the maid had come in while I was gone. I didn't know for sure, but it didn't seem right. The glove felt out of place. I didn't know why, but it did. I started to look around the room. Nothing seemed disturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been moved. I checked the door. It was still locked. I had double-checked when I left, and it was locked now. No one could have gotten in without a key, and there was no sign of forced entry. I picked up the glove with 2 fingers, like it was some kind of contaminated thing I shouldn't touch. The fabric was soft, smooth, too smooth, like it had been worn recently. I turned it over, and that's when I saw the small, faint smudge on the inside of the wrist. It looked like dirt, but something about it felt wrong. Like it was something else. Something darker. My heart started to race. I put the glove down on the bed and went over to the window, pulling the blinds just enough to peek outside. The storm had picked up even more, and the snow was falling in thick sheets. I could barely see the parking lot. The wind was loud, howling, but there was no movement outside. No one was out there. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. It was just a glove. A weird coincidence, that's all. Someone must have walked into the wrong room or something. But then I started to wonder, how did they get in? I was the only guest, and the door had been locked. I hadn't heard anything while I was in the lobby. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the glove again, lying on the bed. What if someone had been in my room while I wasn't there? What if they were still here? I decided to leave the room again, just to get a breath of air. I wasn't thinking straight, and I needed a second to calm down. I grabbed my jacket and went back into the hallway. I walked down to the lobby to see if I could talk to the guy behind the desk, but when I opened the door, it was empty. The TV was still on, but the old man was nowhere to be seen. I stood there for a minute, confused. He hadn't even locked up. It didn't make any sense. I looked around the lobby again, trying to see if he'd gone somewhere or stepped into the back, but there was no sign of him. I walked back to my room, trying to ignore the cold panic in my chest. When I got back to the door, I hesitated. Something felt wrong. I pushed the door open, holding my breath. Everything seemed the same at first, but then I saw it. The cloth was gone. My stomach dropped. It wasn't on the bed anymore. I turned the room upside down, checked the bathroom, the closet, under the bed, nothing. I searched the whole place like a madman, but there was no sign of it. That's when I realized something else. The door was still locked, just like I had left it. But someone had been in here, and they were gone now. The old man, the one behind the desk, was gone too. It didn't make sense. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my stuff, checked out, and drove off into the storm, not looking back. I never saw the old man again. I never went back to that motel. But I still wonder to this day who was in that room, why they left the glove, and how they got in. Sometimes, on nights like this, when the snow falls thick and the wind howls, I feel like I'm still being watched. It was supposed to be an ordinary day. Or at least I thought it would be. I've been a mail carrier for over a decade, so I know the routine. I've worked through storms, handled packages and letters in all kinds of weather, but this storm was different. It was the kind of snowstorm where the world outside feels muffled and frozen, and the air tastes sharp when you breathe it in. I was out early that day, trying to get ahead of the storm. It had started slow, just a few flakes here and there, but by the time I started my route, it had turned into a full-blown blizzard. The snow was coming down thick, the kind of snow that makes it hard to see more than a few feet in front of you. The roads were slippery, and I could barely make out the houses in front of me. I had no choice but to push on, too much to deliver and too little time to stop. I had a few familiar faces on my route, people who lived in old houses and cottages tucked away from the main roads. Most of them were empty this time of year, just winter homes that people stayed in occasionally, but I still had to make the rounds. I didn't mind, it gave me something to do. But today was different. Today, I noticed something odd. The first time I saw him was about an hour into my round. He was standing at the edge of a driveway, right where the road turned into a stretch of trees. The snow was falling so heavily that I barely saw him at first, but when I did, my heart skipped a beat. He was standing still, just watching. His face was obscured by a scarf and a hat, but I could tell he was staring right at me. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe he was just waiting for someone or standing there for the same reason I was out in the storm, to get through it. It wasn't unusual to see a person out and about in the snow, especially in these more isolated areas. But what unsettled me was how long he stood there without moving. I kept glancing back as I delivered the mail to the house, and even though I wasn't sure, it felt like he hadn't moved at all. I finished up that stop quickly and drove to the next house. The snow was making everything look the same, a blur of white. I stopped at the next house, dropped off the letter, and got back into the truck. When I looked up, he was there again. It was the same man. Same spot. Scene stillness. This time, it didn't feel like an accident. He was standing there, just off the road, watching me. The snow was thick around him, so thick that it should have been impossible to see much of anything, but there he was, clearly visible. He was about 100 yards away from me, just standing there with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, not moving. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't want to overthink it, but my instincts were screaming. He had to be following me, right? I tried to shake the feeling off, told myself it was just a storm getting to me. I had to keep moving. I kept driving, my eyes glancing nervously in the rearview mirror. Sure enough, he was still there. It was as if he had never left. As I drove down the next stretch of road, I saw him again, standing by the side of the road, in the same spot, looking at me. At this point, I was seriously unnerved. I slowed down, trying to take in more details, but the snow was coming down so fast that it was hard to make anything out. He didn't seem to be in any hurry. He wasn't walking. He wasn't trying to get anywhere. He was just standing there, watching. I didn't know what to do. I finished the next few stops quickly, my heart pounding in my chest, and glanced out of the truck whenever I could. The snow was starting to really pile up now, and the wind made it harder to see. I couldn't even tell if he was still there. It was getting darker by the minute, the kind of dark that winter storms bring when it feels like night has already fallen, even though it's still afternoon. The last few houses on my route were on the outskirts of town. I had almost finished when I pulled up to the last stop. I didn't see anyone around when I stopped, but when I opened the truck door, I heard something. A sound in the snow. It was him. He was standing at the edge of the driveway again. I hadn't seen him approach. I couldn't even tell where he come from, but there he was, his face hidden behind the scarf, standing just a few feet from me. For a second, I thought I was imagining it. But when I looked up at him, there was no mistaking it. His eyes were on me, watching. I felt my stomach drop. The air felt heavy, and I couldn't move. I wanted to say something, ask him if he needed help, but I couldn't find my voice. He just stood there, his hands still tucked into his pockets, not moving, not saying a word. I knew I had to go. I couldn't stay here. My heart was racing, and my legs felt like lead. I slammed the truck door shut, started it up, and drove away as quickly as I could. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I drove all the way to the post office, my hands shaking on the wheel. The storm was getting worse, and the snow was blinding. When I pulled into the parking lot of the post office, I saw the last thing I wanted to see. His car was parked across the street. Just sitting there. I could see his face now, as he sat in the car, just watching. I don't know how long he stayed there. I don't know if he left or if he's still out there. But I didn't stick around to find out. I called a cab, got a ride home, and never went back to finish my route. I haven't seen him since that day. But I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't just seeing things. I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, waiting. It was one of those perfect winter days, or at least that's what I thought when I first got to the ski resort. The sky was clear, the sun shining brightly, and the air was crisp but not too cold. The kind of day you look forward to when you've been cooped up all week, waiting for your chance to get out and hit the slopes. It was the middle of the afternoon when I decided to take the lift up to one of the higher runs. It was a little later than I usually go, but I thought I could squeeze in a few more runs before the sun started to dip. I was alone, but that wasn't anything unusual. I prefer skiing by myself anyway. There's something calming about it, just the sound of skis carving into the snow and the wind rushing past your ears. It had been a good day so far, and I was looking forward to giving it a few more runs before heading home. The lift was one of those old ones. The kind that doesn't have safety bars or anything. Just a big metal seat with a couple of thick straps. The kind you have to hop onto and hope you don't fall. Not the most comfortable lift, but it wasn't anything I hadn't dealt with before. I had made it to the top of the hill without issue, enjoying the ride up, when something went wrong. The lift stopped suddenly, without warning. 1 minute, I was moving smoothly up the mountain, and the next, everything just came to a halt. It wasn't like the usual pauses where the operator stops it to let someone on or off. This was different. There was no sound, no movement. Just stillness. I figured it was a mechanical issue. These lifts are old, so it's not uncommon for them to get stuck from time to time. But I wasn't in a rush. I had plenty of time, so I just settled back in and waited. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured they'd get it going again soon enough. But as the minutes ticked by, I started to feel the cold creeping in. The wind had picked up a little, and I could feel the chill on my face and hands. My nose was starting to run, and my fingers felt stiff. I tucked my gloves tighter, but the cold seemed to be seeping through everything. I looked down at the base of the lift, hoping to see someone coming to fix the issue. The snow was still coming down lightly, but I could barely make out any movement down there. There were a few skiers down below, but nobody seemed to be paying attention to the lift. Not a single person was looking out, which I found strange. Usually, people notice when the lift stops, especially when it's been stopped for more than a few minutes. I started to feel an uneasy feeling in my stomach. It wasn't just the cold anymore, it was something else. Something about the stillness. The fact that no one was responding. The fact that the lift had been stopped for so long and no one seemed to be coming to help. I looked over at the operator's booth. It was empty. That's when it hit me. I don't know why I didn't think of it earlier, but now it was clear to me. The operator had to have seen that the lift had stopped. And yet, they hadn't done anything. No one was coming to fix it. It was as if they had just left me up here on purpose. I looked at my watch. 15 minutes had passed since the lift had stopped. It didn't make sense. I had never been stuck up here this long before. The lifts always get moving again quickly, even if there's a problem. This was different. Something was wrong. I started to feel the cold sinking deeper into my bones. I tried to shift in my seat, but there was no escaping it. The wind had picked up, and I could feel the snow starting to fall more heavily. I looked around, but there was no sign of any other skiers nearby. I hadn't seen any workers come by. No one had even stopped to check on me. The only sound was the wind whistling past the lift cables. I don't know why, but I tried to call the resort's emergency number. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with my phone, but when I checked the signal, I realized it was gone. No bars. No service. That's when I started to panic. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. It was probably nothing. They were probably just dealing with a malfunction and hadn't gotten around to fixing it yet. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized how isolated I was. The lift didn't go anywhere near the other parts of the resort. I was high up on the mountain, and I was completely alone. I called out, more to myself than anyone, "Hello? Can anyone hear me?" There was no response. I felt a sudden wash of dread, an overwhelming sense of fear that something wasn't right. Why wasn't anyone coming to help me? It made no sense. Lifts don't stop for this long unless there's an emergency. The fact that nobody seemed to care about me stuck up here, it didn't sit right with me. I looked again at the operator's booth, still empty. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like the operator had left me on purpose. Maybe they had seen something they didn't want to deal with. Maybe they had seen me and decided to leave me up here. Or maybe it was something worse. The snow kept coming down harder, and the wind was making it worse. I couldn't feel my fingers anymore, and my feet were starting to go numb. My stomach twisted into knots, and I knew I needed to get off that lift as quickly as possible. I started looking around, trying to see if I could get off on my own. The lift's cable was too high for me to jump, and there was nothing nearby to help me get down. I kept telling myself to stay calm, that it was probably nothing. But as the minutes ticked by, my mind started to race. I couldn't stay up here much longer. I had to get down. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen and terrified, but eventually, I saw a figure in the distance, walking towards the base of the lift. It wasn't the operator, though. It was a skier. A man. He didn't wave or acknowledge me at all, just walked straight past the lift, his head down, not even looking at me. I called out again, louder this time, "Hey! I'm stuck. Can you help me?" He didn't stop. It was then that I realized something was very wrong. I wasn't just stuck on the lift. I was stuck, alone, in the middle of nowhere, with nobody around to help. And whoever had left me up there was going to make sure I stayed there. When I finally got off the lift, I ran straight to the nearest lodge. I didn't stop for anything. I didn't care about my skis, my gear, nothing. Just ran. And when I finally got inside, shaking and panicked, I tried to explain what happened. But the workers there told me that nobody had been in the lift operator booth all day. There hadn't been a single worker up there since the morning. I don't know who or what was up there with me, but I'll never forget the feeling of being left to freeze in the middle of nowhere. I've always loved the quiet of winter camping. There's something peaceful about it, the stillness, the way the world feels shut off from everything. This trip was supposed to be no different. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend up in the mountains, just me, my tent, and the snow. I've done it before, a few times, an unknown novice. I knew how to prepare for the cold and keep myself safe. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened. I drove up to the trailhead a little later than I had planned. The sun had already started to set when I arrived, and the snow was coming down heavy. I wasn't too worried about it. Being alone on the trail was part of the experience. I set up camp by the trees near a small clearing, the kind of spot that's secluded but not too far off the beaten path. I pitched my tent, got everything sorted out, and made sure to stash my food up in a bear bag, away from where I was sleeping. It wasn't bear season, but I'd learned the hard way once before that food should always be kept out of reach. The snow was coming down fast, and the temperature was dropping quickly. After I set up, I crawled into my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and got settled in. The sound of the wind outside was muffled by the walls of the tent, but it was still strong enough to make the whole structure shake now and then. I wasn't worried about it. I had weathered worse before. That night, I managed to sleep fairly well, considering the storm outside. But I woke up early the next morning with an uneasy feeling. I couldn't explain it, but something about the quiet felt off. The usual sounds of nature, the wind, the snow, were almost completely drowned out by a strange stillness. I figured it was just my nerves, maybe because I was alone. I unzipped the tent to check the weather and stretch my legs, and that's when I noticed the first sign that something was wrong. The snow around my campsite had been disturbed. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the more I looked, the more I realized something wasn't right. The snow around my food stash had been moved. The bear bag was no longer where I had left it. I got out of the tent and went to check, heart starting to race a little. Sure enough, it was hanging a few feet away from where I had placed it. The bag was open, and the food I had carefully packed was gone. Only the wrappers were left behind, half buried in the snow. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. It wasn't animals that had done this. The way the bag had been moved, it looked like someone had been searching through it. But why? And how? There were no tracks leading up to the stash, no sign of anything or anyone walking nearby. It was as if whoever took the food had just appeared out of nowhere. I looked around the campsite, my hands shaking as I inspected the area, but everything else seemed undisturbed. I considered packing up and leaving, but then I thought about the slashing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, so I decided to check the tent. That's when I saw it. The side of my tent had been slashed. At first, I thought it was a tear from the wind, but no. This was deliberate. Someone had sliced through the fabric with a sharp object. The cut was clean, and the edges were fresh, not at all frayed like something that would happen naturally from wear or a storm. The thought of someone getting that close to me, in the middle of the night, made my stomach churn. I was frozen for a moment, trying to process it, but I couldn't. I grabbed my pack and rifled through it quickly. Everything seemed fine, at least. Nothing else was obviously disturbed. My gear was all in place, and nothing was missing, but the feeling of being watched crept over me. It was like I was no longer alone in that small, snowy world. I quickly decided to get out of there. I packed up what I could and started breaking down my tent, still on edge, still looking around the trees, the snow, the open ground. But just as I was about to stuff the last of my things into my bag, I noticed something strange. A piece of paper, folded and tucked inside the outer pocket of my bag. My heart dropped. I hadn't put it there. There was no reason for it to be there. I opened it with trembling fingers. The note was short. It simply said, "You're now alone." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My throat felt tight, and for a second, I couldn't breathe. I stood there, staring at the note, trying to make sense of it, but nothing made sense. Who would leave me a note like that? Who would be up here with me? I hadn't seen a single person on the trail. The nearest road was miles away, and there were no other campsites near mine. I was supposed to be alone. I scanned the forest around me again, my eyes darting from tree to tree, but I didn't see anything. No movement. No footprints. Just snow. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't be there another minute. I grabbed my pack, shoved the note into my pocket, and bolted. I didn't care about anything else. I didn't care if I had to leave my gear behind. I didn't care if I was walking straight into a blizzard. All I wanted was to get out of there, to get somewhere safe. The snowstorm was getting worse as I made my way down the trail. I couldn't see very far ahead, the snow was falling so heavily, but I didn't stop. The thought of turning back, of going to my car and having to drive through the storm, was terrifying, but it was the only thing that felt right. By the time I reached the trailhead, I could barely feel my fingers or my toes. I was exhausted, shaken, but I was still alive. I sat in my car for a long time before I could bring myself to drive. The storm was so thick that I had to take it slow, but I didn't care. I just needed to get home. I still don't know who left that note or what happened up there. I don't know if someone was watching me the whole time or if it was just a sick joke. But I can't go back to that place. I still think about it. Every time I go out in the snow, every time I set up camp alone, I can't help but wonder if I'm really alone, or if someone's still out there, watching. It started out like any other winter. I'd moved to the cabin in the woods at the beginning of November. I needed some time away, and the isolation seemed like just what I needed. The property was small but secluded, with miles of trees surrounding it. I'd always enjoyed the quiet, the space. The kind of solitude where you can think, or not think, as much as you want. At first, the winter was beautiful. Snow on the trees, the scent of wood smoke, the crackle of a stove in the evening. I spent the first few weeks settling in, chopping wood, getting everything prepared for the months ahead. There was no real reason to be worried about being alone, and honestly, I didn't mind it. I had a few traps set up in the woods for hunting. I've learned how to trap when I was younger, and now, living out here, it seemed like the best way to stock up on food. It was a quiet, methodical process. I head out in the mornings, check my snares and traps, reset them if needed, and return home. The usual routine. The first thing that made me pause was when I found a trap had been triggered, but there was nothing caught in it. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe an animal had gotten away. I reset it and went about my day, not giving it much thought. But then it happened again. And again. Over the course of a week, I found several traps tripped, but there was never any animal. There wasn't even any sign of a struggle, just a trap snapped shut with nothing in it. I figured it was just coincidence. Maybe the weather was playing tricks on the mechanisms, or perhaps the traps weren't set right. But when I went to check them one morning and found fresh footprints in the snow leading from one of my traps to the edge of the woods, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The footprints were too large to be mine. Too deliberate. They were too fresh, too clean. They didn't look like they had been made by an animal, and they definitely weren't mine. I followed the prints for a while, but they disappeared into the thick forest. No sign of anyone or anything. I checked the rest of the traps. Most were fine, but a few more had been tripped, nothing caught. It wasn't just the traps that were acting strange. One evening, after a long day of chopping wood, I returned to the cabin to find that my front door had been cracked open. Just a little bit, not enough for someone to get in unnoticed, but enough for me to know that it hadn't been like that when I left. There was no sign of forced entry, and nothing seemed missing. It made me uneasy, but I still tried to convince myself that it was probably just the wind, or maybe I hadn't locked it properly. I checked everything, relocked the door, checked the windows, and made sure the stove was burning properly. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, the pattern continued. More traps had been tripped. Some were just slightly reset, others fully sprung but empty. But there was no sign of anything, no tracks, no scent of any animal or person nearby. Whoever was doing this was careful. Too careful. It was the second week of December when I finally decided to do something about it. I had to. I couldn't keep resetting traps for whatever or whoever was messing with me. I needed to find out what was happening, or at least get some answers. I got up early that morning, before sunrise, and headed into the woods with a rifle. The snow was heavy, falling in thick, slow flakes, and the wind was starting to pick up. I made my way through the trees, checking each of the traps as I went. Everything was normal. Until I got to the last trap. It had been triggered again. But this time, there was something different. A small piece of cloth was caught in the mechanism. It wasn't a big thing, but it was enough to make my heart pound. The fabric was dark, almost black, and it looked like it had been torn off something, My first thought was that it was maybe from a jacket or a sleeve. But who the hell would be out here in the woods messing with my stuff? I crouched down, looking around. The snow was deep, and the only tracks I could see were my own. I looked around more carefully, scanning the trees and the ground. It was too quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I spent the next few hours setting more traps, but I couldn't stop thinking about that cloth. It didn't make sense. It was too deliberate. Someone was here, in the woods, messing with my traps and leaving things behind. I was sure of it. That night, I stayed up later than usual. The fire crackled in the stove, the wind held outside, but I couldn't relax. Every little noise in the cabin had me on edge. Every creak of the wood, every shift of the snow. It was as though I was expecting someone to knock at the door at any moment. Around midnight, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps in the snow outside. Slow and deliberate, like someone walking in circles around the cabin. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. I was alone. Or, at least, I was supposed to be. I waited, listening, trying to hear if the steps were getting closer. It was impossible to tell, the wind howling outside making everything sound muffled. I grabbed the rifle, sat as still as I could, and waited. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, the steps stopped. Dead silence. I stayed up the rest of the night, never once leaving my spot by the stove. The next morning, I found something new. More tracks in the snow. They were small, but they weren't mine. These ones were fresh, leading from the woods toward the cabin. There were no other signs. No footprints going away. Just circles around the cabin. I don't know who it was or what they wanted. I don't know if it was just some sick joke or if I was being watched, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. I packed up everything I could, got in the truck, and left that day. I don't think I'll be going back there. Something about those traps, that cloth, the footsteps, they'll haunt me for a long time. Yeah. I rented a cabin in a small fishing lodge for a week during winter. It was one of those places you hear about but never expect to visit. The kind of place tucked away at the end of a long dirt road, far from the nearest town. It seemed perfect for what I needed, some solitude, some peace, and plenty of fishing. The lodge itself wasn't much, just a small wooden building with a few rooms for rent, a little office, and a kitchen for guests to use. The owner, a man named George, was older, probably in his late 50s or early 60s, with a thick beard and a deep, raspy voice. He was friendly enough, though his manner seemed a little distant at times. I assumed it was just the cold weather getting to him. The first few days went exactly as I expected. I spent my mornings on the frozen lake, fishing, reading, and just enjoying the isolation. The afternoons were spent back in my cabin, sipping coffee and watching the snow fall. It was peaceful, maybe a bit too peaceful, but it was exactly what I needed. The trouble started on the fourth day, after I returned from a long day of fishing. I had spent hours on the ice, and the cold had gotten into my bones. As I walked up the short path from the parking area to the lodge, I noticed something odd. The front door of the lodge was slightly ajar. It wasn't wide open, but it was definitely not closed the way I had left it earlier that morning. At first, I figured it was just the wind. The snow had been falling heavily all day, and it was possible that it had blown the door open. I pushed it shut, locked it, and went back to my cabin, trying not to think too much about it. But that night, as I sat inside sipping my tea, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The next morning, I left early again, just like the day before. When I returned later in the day, I found the door to the lodge unlocked once again. This time, it was even more ajar than the day before. Not just a little, but almost halfway open. My heart sank a little. I knew that I had locked the door when I left. I was sure of it. I walked inside cautiously, half expecting someone to be there. The place was quiet, just as I had left it. Nothing seemed out of place, but the unease settled in my chest like a rock. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it was hard not to. Someone had been here, and they hadn't bothered to lock the door behind them. I spent the rest of the evening in my cabin, pacing and thinking, wondering who could have been in there. Could it have been George? Maybe he had forgotten to lock up after checking on things. That seemed plausible, so I tried to brush it off. But the feeling didn't go away. The next few days followed the same pattern. I would leave in the morning to fish, and when I came back, the door was always unlocked. Sometimes it was slightly open, sometimes it was more. Every time, I would close it and lock it behind me, but the dread was building. No one else was supposed to be at the lodge. George had told me he was the only one working there during the winter months, and I hadn't seen any other cars parked near the lodge. On the sixth night, I decided I couldn't keep ignoring it. I was already feeling like I was losing my grip on the situation, and I needed to know what was going on. I stayed up late, watching from the window of my cabin, hoping to see something, anything. The snow had stopped falling, and the night was clear and still. My eyes were starting to get heavy, but I forced myself to stay awake, staring out at the lodge. Around midnight, I saw a figure. A shadow moved in front of the lodge's window. I froze. My heart raced. I had never seen anyone there before, and now there was someone in front of the building, moving in and out of the shadows. I waited, my breath caught in my throat. The person seemed to be circling around the lodge, walking slowly, methodically. I couldn't see their face, but their movements were deliberate. It was hard to tell what they were doing, but I knew they were there for a reason. After what felt like hours, the figure finally disappeared into the dark. I couldn't hear any car engines or other sounds, and I was still alone. I had no choice but to wait until morning. When the first light of day crept through the trees, I left my cabin cautiously and walked over to the lodge. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what had happened. I reached the front door and, sure enough, it was ajar again. But this time, there was something else. A small, crumpled piece of paper lay just inside the door. My hand shook as I picked it up and unfolded it. The handwriting was uneven, rushed, and hard to make out, but it was clear enough. It said, "It's better to keep the door open." I didn't know what to make of it. Why would someone leave a note like that? What did it mean? I looked around the lobby but found nothing else that seemed out of place. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, clung to me more now than ever. But I didn't know what to do next. I didn't stay another night in that lodge. I packed up my things, locked the cabin, and drove straight to the nearest town. I didn't go back, and I never will. I still think about that note, about the feeling that someone had been watching me from the shadows every time I came back. I'll never know who it was or why they were there, but I don't need to. That place, the lodge, is out of my life for good. I've never told anyone the story, not in full at least. I've mentioned parts of it to a couple of friends here and there, but I've never really gone into detail. It's not easy to talk about, and honestly, I still don't know how I feel about what happened. It's been over a year now, but every time I think about it, my stomach tightens. I don't know if I'm still processing it, or if I'll ever fully understand why it happened. But I'll tell you the whole story, the way it happened. It was winter, and the snowboarding season was in full swing. I've been looking forward to getting out on the slopes for weeks. I work a desk job, and this is one of the only times I get to feel truly free, out on the mountain with fresh powder under my board, the cold wind on my face. I usually go by myself. Sometimes I'll join up with people for a drink after, but I like the quiet time on the mountain. It helps clear my head. So, on this particular day, I was at the resort pretty early. It had just snowed overnight, so the conditions were perfect. I had my usual gear, and I was heading up the lift, ready to hit the trails. The sky was overcast, but I didn't think much of it. It wasn't too cold either, just that crisp air you get when the snow is fresh. I spent the first few hours carving down the runs, getting in a good rhythm. The resort was busy, but not too crowded. Around noon, I decided to take a break. I found a little area off the main trail, not far from one of the lifts. It was just a small clearing, quiet enough that I could take a breath and grab a snack without the noise of the crowd. I was munching on some granola bars, standing by the trees when I saw him. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was coming down the slope, slow and steady, almost like he was trying to keep his balance. He wasn't doing very well, swerving a bit more than someone who knew what they were doing. But it wasn't unusual. Sometimes people were still learning or had less experience. Then, I noticed he was stopping more often, almost like he was struggling. I could see him wincing, and when he looked in my direction, I saw something in his eyes. It was hard to describe. Fear, maybe. Well, I wasn't sure, but something didn't sit right. And he started to head toward me, stumbling slightly as he came closer. "Hey, you alright?" I called out, trying to be friendly. I assumed he might have twisted something, or maybe he was just out of breath. He nodded but didn't speak at first. Then he grimaced like he was in pain. I'm hurt," he said. "I think I twisted my ankle, and I got lost." I hesitated for a second. He didn't look too injured, but he also didn't look like he was in great shape either. His clothes were basic, just a jacket and pants, not really the gear you'd expect from someone who knew what they were doing on the slopes. But the thing that struck me was how he kept looking around, almost nervously, as if he were worried about something. "Where did you come from?" I asked. "You're now on the trail, Manitoba." "I don't know," he said, his voice sounding strained. "I was following a trail and then it just kind of disappeared. I don't know where I am." Now, that didn't sit right either. There are a lot of marked trails on the mountain, and while some of them could be difficult to follow, they don't just disappear. I could tell something was off, but I figured maybe I was overthinking it. I'd seen people get lost before, and honestly, it wasn't unheard of for someone to panic when they realized they were off track. "All right," I said. "Let me take a look at that ankle." I walked up to him, and he was sitting on the ground now, holding his leg awkwardly. His ankle wasn't swelling, but it did look like it was bothering him. It didn't seem like a major injury, probably just a sprain. But there was something about the way he was acting. He wasn't looking at me much, and his eyes kept darting around. His hands were shaking too, though it could have been from the cold. "You're not far from the lift," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "We can get you back up there, get you checked out." He nodded but didn't seem all that reassured. "I don't think I can make it that far," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "I've been trying to find my way back for hours." I felt a little more concerned now. Hours. If he'd been out here for hours, why hadn't anyone else seen him? I hadn't heard any calls for help on the radio or anything, and there weren't any signs of a group being nearby. I looked back down the mountain, but I didn't see anyone else coming down the slope. "All right," I said. "I'll help you up the hill. It's not far." I helped him to his feet, and we began to make our way back toward the main trail. I noticed he wasn't really using his injured ankle, but we kept trying to act like he was fine. It wasn't until we got a little further from the main trail that I started feeling uneasy. The area was getting more isolated, the slope quieter. The wind picked up, and it felt colder, like we were moving away from the warmth of the main ones. We came to a clearing, and the man suddenly stopped. "This is good," he said. "I need to sit down." I felt a sudden wave of unease. It wasn't a logical feeling, just a deep, instinctual discomfort. The snow was deeper here, and the trees were thick around us. It felt too quiet. Like no one would hear us if something went wrong. Before I could respond, he turned to me with a strange look in his eyes. He wasn't panicking anymore, not like he had before. Now, there was something colder about his expression, like a calmness that didn't belong. "Hey, he started, his voice low, "there's a spot up ahead. I could use some help getting to it. It's a little more hidden, away from the crowds. You can't always get to it by the lift." I looked around. The spot didn't seem familiar, and I could tell we were getting further from the main paths. The snow was thicker, and there was no trail leading further up, just more trees. Something wasn't right. "All right," I said, forcing myself to sound calm. "Let's just go back to the lift." Well, he didn't argue. He just looked at me again, that same cold look in his eyes, like he was waiting for me to make the wrong move. And then, just like that, it hit me. He wasn't hurt. He wasn't lost. I wasn't helping him at all. I was being led further and further from help. Before I could take another step, I turned on my heel, deciding to make my way back the way we came. That's when I saw it, the tracks. Not mine, but his. They weren't leading back to the main trail. They were leading off toward the trees. They weren't tracks that someone who was lost or hurt would have made. I looked back at him, and his expression had changed again. This time, there was a hint of a smile on his face. "I don't think you want to go that way," he said quietly. I didn't wait another second. I bolted. I pushed myself harder than I ever had before, cutting through the snow like I had a chance to outrun whatever the hell was going on. I didn't look back. I didn't tear. I just ran straight to the lift, and once I was on it, I didn't stop until I was safely back at the lodge. I never saw that man again. I don't know if he was trying to lure me somewhere or if he had something worse in mind. But I know for sure that if I hadn't trusted my instincts and turned around, I wouldn't be telling you this story right now. I never went back to that slope, and I never snowboarded alone in the backcountry again. Oh. I've been sitting here, trying to decide whether or not I should share this. It's hard, talking about something that's so unsettling. But I feel like if I don't, it'll just keep eating at me. Maybe writing it out will help me make sense of it. I don't know. I just know that what happened to me wasn't right, and I can't shake it. This happened last winter. I was staying at a cabin by the beach. It was supposed to be a quiet, peaceful getaway. A break from everything. I'd been working too much, and I just needed time alone to recharge. The cabin was a little old but cozy, tucked away far from the nearest neighbors. The kind of place where you don't see another soul for miles, especially in the winter when most people avoid the coast. I remember when I first arrived, everything was perfect. The beach was quiet, just the sound of the waves crashing and the occasional call of a seagull. It was peaceful. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. I spent the first couple of days there just walking along the shore, reading, cooking simple meals. It was exactly what I needed. But the longer I stayed, the more I started to notice little things. Nothing major at first, just oddities that didn't seem to fit. Like how the floorboards would creak even when I knew no one else was in the cabin. Or how I'd wake up in the middle of the night, sure that I'd heard someone at the door. The sounds weren't always loud, but they were there. And I'd tell myself it was nothing, just the wind, I'll settling, or my imagination playing tricks on me. But still, it gnawed at me. One night, it got worse. I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the window. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to pull me from sleep. I lay there, frozen for a moment, straining my ears. The sound came again. A slow, dragging scrape, like something was moving just outside. My heart started to race, and I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a raccoon or some other small creature. But even as I thought that, I knew it didn't feel right. I reached over and turned on the lamp beside the bed. The room lit up, and the snow outside the window was glowing in the pale light of the moon. Everything was still. Or too still. I listened closely but heard nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was alone, after all. There wasn't anyone else for miles. I pulled the covers up to my chin and tried to go back to sleep. But I couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The wind had picked up outside, howling through the cracks in the cabin, but there was something else, too. A sense of being watched. I got up, grabbed my flashlight from the bedside table, and went to the window. I pushed the curtains aside and aimed the light down at the crowd outside. My breath caught in my throat when I saw the footprints. They were right there, just outside the window, in the snow. Fresh prints, clear as day. The thing was, the snow hadn't been disturbed for hours. The last snowstorm had ended long before I'd gone to bed, and there was no way anyone had been out there recently. Yet there they were, footprints, deep in the snow, like someone had walked right up to my window. They weren't just scattered like someone had walked by, they were deliberate, circling the cabin. I stood there, staring at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My first thought was maybe it was a prank. Maybe some locals decided to mess with me. But that didn't feel right either. This wasn't some innocent joke. The prints were too close, too deliberate. They weren't just outside my window, they were all the way around the cabin, like someone had been walking in a slow, careful circle. I turned the light off and stood there in the dark for a while, just listening. I couldn't hear anything. No movement, no sounds of someone walking around outside. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger. My mind raced. Who could be out there? How did they get so close without me hearing them? The nearest neighbor was miles away. And even if someone had decided to wander up from the beach, it didn't make sense that they'd be so close to the cabin without a sound. The snow was thick and heavy, and you couldn't walk through it without making noise, especially not that much. I didn't feel safe anymore. I wanted to lock the doors, bar the windows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the person, whoever they were, wasn't done. They were still out there. Watching. I went into the living room and grabbed a heavy lamp, holding it close to me as I moved toward the door. I peeked through the curtains, but I couldn't see anything in the dark. The wind was howling again, making it hard to hear any movement. I stood there, staring out, waiting. I don't know for how long. It felt like hours. Nothing happened. I eventually made my way to the back of the cabin, where I had a small wooden deck. I opened the door cautiously, feeling the bitter cold hit me right away. The snow was deeper here, covering the deck, but the footsteps weren't there. It was as if they'd stopped at the windows and then moved away. But the feeling of unease didn't leave. The next morning, I went outside to check the snow again, just to see if I was imagining things. Maybe it was a trick of the light, I thought. Maybe I was so shaken up that I was seeing things that weren't there. But the prints were still there. Exactly where I had seen them the night before. I spent the next couple of days trying to ignore it, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild. I stayed inside, keeping the curtains drawn, and didn't go out much. But every time I stepped into the living room, I kept glancing at the windows, waiting to see more prints, waiting for whatever was out there to come back. I never saw anyone, though. No one came to the cabin. No one knocked on the door. No one else came up the beach or drove past. But the prints kept showing up. Every morning when I checked, the same prints would be there outside my window, circling around the cabin, as if someone had been there all night. After a few days, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my things, checked out early, and left. I didn't feel safe there anymore. I didn't even want to stay another night. I've never been back to that cabin, and I haven't stayed in another remote place like that since. It feels foolish now, but I'm still afraid to go back to places that isolated. I still don't know who or what was out there, and honestly, I don't want to know. I'd rather live with the uncertainty than risk finding out. I think about those footprints every time I see snow. I wonder if it's the same person who's out there, still walking around cabins. It was one of those cold winter days where the air seemed to cut through you, sharp and biting. I'd been out running errands in the neighborhood, just a simple afternoon. Nothing seemed out of place at first. It wasn't until I started walking back home that I noticed something odd. The houses on my street, the ones that were usually so lively, were dead silent. Normally, this neighborhood is full of people coming and going. Kids playing, dogs barking, families chatting in their driveways. But today, it was like the whole block had disappeared. At first, I thought it was just the weather. Snow had been falling nonstop for a few days, and everything was covered in a thick blanket of white. Maybe people were just staying in, waiting for the storm to pass. I figured I'd ask my neighbor about it, though. I walked up to their front door, knocked, and waited. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time, and still nothing. That was strange. I knew they were home, or at least I thought I did. I'd seen their cart parked out front earlier in the day. I tried the doorbell, even though I knew it wasn't working the last time I visited. Still, nothing. I wasn't sure what to think, but I decided to check with the house next door. Maybe something had come up. So, I walked over, knocked on the door. Nothing. I stood there for a moment, feeling a bit foolish. It was cold and getting darker, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. The windows of the house were dark, and the lights inside weren't on. It wasn't like my neighbors to just shut themselves off like this. They were usually pretty friendly. I moved to the next house, thinking maybe this was all just a coincidence. No one answered there either. By now, I was starting to feel uneasy, like something wasn't quite right. I knocked on every door on that street, one by one, and not a single person answered. There were no cars in the driveways except for one. But the odd thing was, The cars that were usually parked outside were gone. The houses that were normally filled with light and noise were dark and still. It was almost like everyone just up and left, but I couldn't figure out why. I started walking around the backyards, peeking through fences. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I kept hoping for a sign of life. Maybe someone was out in the backyard, maybe the houses just seemed empty from the front. But no. There was nothing. It was like all the life in the neighborhood had vanished. I even tried calling a few people. The phone rang, but no one picked up. I left a couple of messages, but no one returned my calls. I walked back to the front of the street and stopped in the middle, trying to make sense of it all. It was like a ghost town, and I had no idea why. It was late afternoon by then, and the sun was low in the sky, making the whole street feel even more isolated. I decided to call the local sheriff's office, just to ask if anyone had heard anything or if there had been any problems. Maybe there had been an emergency or a weather warning, something that would explain the strange quiet. The officer who answered seemed puzzled, but he didn't have much information. "No, sir," he said. "Nothing out of the ordinary. We haven't received any complaints about that neighborhood." I thanked him, but that just left me feeling more unsettled. Something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. At that point, I started looking more closely at the houses. As I walked along, I noticed something even stranger. The shutters were all closed. Every single house. Even those that never bothered to shut them in the winter. It felt like I was in a different world, like the neighborhood had been abandoned overnight. I walked up to one of the houses, one that had always been brightly lit before, and looked through the windows. The curtains were drawn tight, but I thought I could make out shapes inside. I was about to knock on the door again when I heard a voice. I froze, listening hard. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination, but I could have sworn someone said something, like a muffled conversation coming from behind one of the windows. I took a step closer and listened, but there was no more sound. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. Maybe someone was inside, maybe they just didn't want to talk. But that didn't explain the eerie quiet, the way the whole street seemed dead. Why would people just stop answering their doors, even if they didn't want to be bothered? I couldn't make sense of it. I spent the next hour walking around, trying every house. Each one seemed just as lifeless as the last. No sign of movement, no answers at the doors. No lights, no sounds, just the occasional creak of an old porch under my feet. Finally, after a few more unanswered knocks, I turned to go home, feeling more than a little scared. I was about halfway down the street when I saw something else that made my blood run cold. There was a car parked up ahead, off to the side, behind a hedge. I hadn't noticed it before, and I would have bet money it wasn't there when I walked past earlier. I walked closer, trying not to make any noise, and looked inside. The keys were still in the ignition, and the door was slightly ajar, but there was no one around. I looked down the street and saw nothing but empty houses. I don't know why, but I felt like I had to know who was in that car, so I made my way toward it. I wasn't even sure if I should get that close, but my feet carried me there anyway. As I got closer, I saw a piece of paper stuck to the windshield. I pulled it off, and the handwriting was shaky, like someone had written it in a hurry. The note read, "Please leave. Don't ask questions." I stood there for a second, staring at the note in my hand. I should have run. I should have turned around right then and there and gone back inside, locked the door, and stayed put. But I couldn't. My feet wouldn't move. The air around me felt heavier, colder. It was like the neighborhood, the whole street, was holding its breath. I turned around, quickly, looking back down the street toward my house. The quiet pressed in on me, so thick that I could hardly breathe. I hurried back to my place, locked the door behind me, and sat down. The phone rang again, but this time I didn't answer it. I don't know what happened to the neighbors. I don't know if they'll ever come back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was going on had something to do with me, something to do with that note. I've been trying to get the nerve to leave the house, but every time I look up a window, it feels like someone is watching me. I'm not sure if I'll ever feel safe in this place again.